Hello everyone, and welcome to Starscream's Ghost, a Transformers podcast, an episode-by-episode podcast guide through the classic Transformers Generation 1 cartoon. I am Jeremy Graves, and joining me, as per usual, for this very special edition of the podcast, my good partner in crime in this wonderful journey through this classic cartoon. Good sir, Mr. Andy Hanley, I've got one thing to start off the conversation with, and quite frankly, it can only be bar weep, bar nah weep, ninny bong.
Yeah, bar weep, grana weep, ninny bong to you too.
Oh, I got it wrong, darn it.
Yeah, I've got better things to do tonight than die because I've got a podcast to record.
Do you know what? I've been trying so hard to practice that to get that right, and I've just ballsed up. Well, no, I've done it once now, so forevermore.
Yeah, I feel like this is proof of like how many times I've seen this film now that I can just do that. Like, it's just a thing. It's in my head. Like this, I know the universal greeting off by heart.
So, we should say from the outset, because it's quite likely that a fair few people listening to this edition of the podcast, you may be a first-time listener, of which, thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show. We do want to make a note from the outset that this episode in particular is going to be probably very different to what we would normally do on the podcast, because normally we're deep diving into each of the episodes in the broadcast order, but obviously, with this being the movie, it's a much longer episode, quite frankly, but also there is a heck of a lot of background information about the film as well, so we are going to be diving into that. If you would like to go back and listen to all of our thoughts regarding Season 1 and 2, you can do that right now, be it on the likes of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, wherever you have found this podcast, you can tune into each and every episode as well. And if you feel so inclined you want to see us discuss this, you can. Simply head over to YouTube, type in Starscream's Ghost Podcast, and you should find us just fine. So, Andy, as I said, this is going to be a different episode, but I am really, really looking forward to discussing this because we have watched all of Season 1, all of Season 2. We've even gone through, like, the bonus episodes that we recorded as well, going into, like, quizzes and background information, aplenty on those. And we finally reached Transformers the movie. How are you feeling going into this podcast?
Yeah, very excited, and I'm doubly excited because I know we come at this from very different angles. Where you have not seen this film in a very long time and got to watch it recently for the first time in forever. I've watched this film far too many times and still enjoy it every time that I do. So, two very different perspectives, and yeah, like this film is so important to me. Like, it's such a kind of a seismic moment in like my media consumption that, you know, kids brain me at the time I don't think realize, but like I feel like this set the scene and set the tone for so much of what I came to like in terms of being a fan of anime and the kind of shows and films that I liked. And yeah, like it's really quite a defining moment for me, I feel like. So it's cool to be able to go and talk it through.
Definitely. From my perspective, this is also a really important film to me, but honestly, in doing this podcast, I finally realised just how much of a seismic shift this film actually is in the entire fandom of Transformers, which is very weird to say that now in the year 2022, considering I saw this must have been sometime maybe mid to late 90s for the first time. I don't know exactly when I first saw this, but only realising this now, and I'll go into that more as we start discussing the story and stuff during the podcast, but coming to that conclusion now, in March of 2022 when we're recording this, it's pretty mental from my point of view.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because almost, for me, sort of the interesting thing has been watching it off the back of watching Seasons 1 and 2, because I feel like, and I may have mentioned this in the past, that I think whilst a lot of people were kind of really shocked and blown away by Transformers the movie when it first came out, of like, oh my god, look what they've done, because my main background as a kid was the UK comics, I was kind of less surprised by it, because the UK comics were always a bit more grown up. They were always more willing to kind of kill characters off or put them in deep comas and stasis. I mean, like I've said before, like Optimus Prime, he just kept on dying in the comics. So like watching him do it in the films was just like, oh, again? So like I think I was not quite as kind of shaken to my core because felt like I was a little bit more used to it. But it's certainly interesting watching it off the back of Seasons 1 and 2, and Season 2 in particular, where, you know, it is quite light in tone on a regular basis, and there is that very obvious kind of shift and sort of lack of continuity, really, of just like, we've seen characters get blasted by Megatron's gun all these times and they're fine, and then suddenly you get to the film and one blast and it's like, oh no, you're just smoke pouring out of your mouth. That's not good. And so it's sort of it struck me a bit harder, I think, coming off of those two seasons of just like watching it from that opposite view of clearly like the kids who watch the cartoon religiously rather than the comic, and seeing like, oh man, that must have been a real mind trip to go into this. Yay, I get to see Optimus Prime on the big screen. Oh no, he's gone all grey and dead. So that's been kind of the fascinating thing for me, because obviously I've been aware of that incongruence, but I've not seen it quite as markedly like for myself before.
Yeah, well, you know what? You've talked a little bit about the background now. I think that is a very good place to start with the film. So, let's start talking about the background of Transformers the movie. Now, to begin with, from a date and time point of view, which I think is very important to note, the series, and that being season 2, if I'm correct, I will call it the newest episode, was broadcast in January of 1986, but the film did not make it into the cinemas stateside until August of 1986. So we're to assume that during that time, Andy, it's just been reruns of older episodes at this point. So in terms of brand new story material, it's been over half a year at this point since anyone has had anything new.
Yes, yeah, and I mean that is kind of your typical, cartoon syndication. It's why season 2 has so many episodes, as we've sort of previously discussed, because you really want kind of a chunk of 50 episodes plus for TV channels back then to say, great, this is something we can just run on a loop, we can just show random episodes, we can drop it in whenever, and so you can kind of imagine that there was a good long chunk of probably kids turning on like, it's Transformers, oh, I've seen this episode over and over again, which I think is something every kid can sympathise with, because there are always those cartoons of like, oh, this one again, I've seen this a million times now.
And there were some that would always like recur more than others as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, development of the movie began during the first season of Transformers, broadcast in 1984. The first draft was submitted around mid-November 1984, with a later revised draft by mid-February 85. Though I think it's worth noting, the final draft, quote-unquote, or a finalised draft, as it were, was not actually probably completed until about December of 85. Ron Friedman is credited as being the only person who worked on 2 finished versions of the script that were written. More on that note in a moment. But for some context, Ron Friedman had worked in television for decades prior to this film, and as a notable credit in the context of Hasbro and Transformers, he wrote the original 5-part mini-story for G.I. Joe, the cartoon that is, called The Mass Device. And additionally, at the same time as working on Transformers the movie, he was also working on G.I. Joe the movie, as both films were in production at roughly the same time. It's important to note this, because it's been noted by various people that there were so many hierarchical levels within Hasbro working down through the likes of Sunbow Productions and Marvel. The initial screenplay, according to Flint Dille, who was a story consultant on the film, and if you've seen a number of Transformers documentaries, he's normally the one that's speaking in them, because he's the most accessible at this point, I assume. He said that the original script was a collection of beats and ideas that everyone wanted included, as in that the hierarchy wanted included, but it was an incohesive mess at times, some might say. But then what Dille and Jay Bacall, who I believe was a producer on the film, did was they reworked that version of the script to make it shootable, if you will, as in so it could actually be turned into a film. Now, what was the original story, you may be wondering? Now, Andy, I'm not sure if you're aware, but apparently the story was going to be known as The Secrets of Cybertron. And this story would see Optimus Prime travel to the heart of Cybertron to learn the origins of the Transformers themselves, discovering that Cybertron itself was a Transformer through the Matrix of Leadership, and because of the Matrix would actually activate the planet Transformer, if you will. This culminating in a battle, basically seeing the inhabitants of Cybertron versus a planet-sized Transformer, that being Unicron. Were you aware of that?
And yeah, and I think I've sort of talked about this a little bit. I think it was on this podcast and not just some random conversation we had. I can never remember these days. But like that's sort of something that the UK comics leaned into in the end instead, where they basically created the idea of Primus versus Unicron, and kind of Primus being like the god and Unicron being the Satan, effectively, of the Transformers world. And it never quite, went in that direction, but it had its own origin story around how Unicron became a planet, or a planet-sized transformer, and all of that stuff. So yeah, I was kind of dimly aware that it had, it had like its own background from that. But yeah, it's kind of, it's kind of interesting when you look at that as a concept, because that's both quite interesting, but also maybe not as good a movie as we get instead.
So, despite Flint Dille and Joe Bacall, the producer that I just mentioned, being happy with the script that they had come up with, the higher-ups and the hierarchy that I mentioned said it wasn't what they asked for. Now, it's worth noting at this point that reworked script, The Secrets of Cybertron, that we've just been talking about, Andy, that script would surface in the series, but only elements of it would. The entire script has never actually surfaced online. There's no actual known reason. It may just be due to how long it's been, probably likely a bunch of NDAs, and it's probably locked inside a vault somewhere in Marvel HQ or something, quite frankly. But this Dille-Bacall reworked script is seemingly unrelated to the final second draft turned in by Ron Friedman in late April of 1985. So basically, that reworked script is not this movie at all, quite frankly.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting, and I mean, again, in terms of like the revisions and the reworks that this had, I think I mentioned before, like I need to go back and revisit it, because there is like a UK, it was maybe actually from the US side, like a comic edition of Transformers the movie that I believe has some subtle changes from the film, because they were still working from like an earlier draft than even the final one there. So, I don't know if you can hear an ice cream van in the background.
I was about to say, what the heck? We're leaving this in the edit, by the way. I'm just saying.
I mean, you did say that I deserved some ice cream earlier on. So.
Yeah, fair. Very, very true. And you know what? Ice cream for all, quite frankly. So this now, in fact, actually, just to answer your question, that comic you mentioned, that is actually true as well, because that came up in a lot of my research, that they were working effectively from an earlier script or an earlier version of the film story. So this is so weird hearing an ice cream van in the background, but I'm just going to roll with it. But that story would be what makes it in the comic. But like you say, there are some subtle or perhaps interesting differences, which I'm not sure what they are because I've never read it myself.
Yeah, I have read it and I need to reread it because I'm super curious, because it's one of those things, like I don't remember anything really massively standing out of like, oh, that wasn't in the film particularly. I do remember it being a bit different, but not in any kind of fundamentally like massive way. So yeah, maybe at some point I will sit down and reread that. I feel like it's in one of the UK classics compilations that is on Comixology, or Comixology RIP now, Amazon.
So, what did the higher-ups actually want? What did this hierarchy that I mentioned want from the film? Simply put, they wanted a story to turn over to a new roster of characters to re-energize sales in the toy line. Because by the time the movie was going to be released, it would have been 2 years into the franchise, so things needed to be shaken up to keep the machine churning along, if you will. Now the thing to remember at this point in time, when it comes to the cartoon business, if you will, to say this from a very blunt, harsh business perspective, the cartoons were simply toys for the adverts. Much as yourself and I, Andy, and perhaps everyone else listening to this, or any other Transformers fan, quite frankly, has become really attached to characters, and we like certain characters more than others. We feel we have a unique connection with some of them. As far as the higher-ups were concerned, are they shifting toys? Nope. Cut them. Quite frankly. That's basically what it was like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, it worked, right? We've talked through the seasons 1 and 2 of this podcast. I mean, you've heard me wax lyrical about the Insecticons and how, I got a shrapnel off the back of that. We've had all the special team stuff where it's like, yeah, had all those guys because, and I mean, actually that was, again, more on the comics than the cartoon, but it was the same rule applies of, like, hey, we've got these big new robots coming out, work these into your stories, make them a big deal, make them super powerful and important. And yeah, of course that stuff works on kids. Like, you know, it's kind of, you know, crazy when you look back on it and realize all this fondness you have for things is just somebody trying to sell you stuff. But hey, the world hasn't changed very much in that sense.
I know, right? I remember a story you told on a previous podcast where you literally were in a shop, you saw an Insecticon, and you were saying to your parents, look, I need this Insecticon. He can do this and this as his ability. He's really good.
Yeah, exactly that. And there were certainly, there were plenty, you know, a lot of the Transformers I ended up with, again, even off the back of this movie, was just like, oh, they were cool in the film, so, you know, I want this one.
So ultimately, the higher-ups got what they wanted in the second draft script by Ron Friedman, who, now, to be fair, and we need to give him some credit here as well, he had to work within the very strict parameters that he had been set by the higher-ups. So whether you ultimately like the story or not, he was basically given guidelines he had to follow. Now, I mentioned those guidelines, all of this being despite people who were working closely on the show, such as writers, directors, and creatives, all expressing their thoughts on the relationships that we've just been talking about, Andy, that the audience would have had with the characters. Now, to add further to this, Ron Friedman himself did protest killing off Optimus Prime specifically. To quote the man himself, in an interview in December 2013 on toddmaffey.com, he said the following, quote, "To remove Optimus Prime, to physically remove Daddy from the family, that wasn't going to work. I told Hasbro and their lieutenants they would have to bring him back, but they said no and had great things planned." In other words, they were going to create new, more expensive toys. They didn't recognise that Optimus Prime was the heartbeat of the Autobots. The strong fatherly presence that made sure everybody else behaves and tries to live up to his example. You cannot pass that over and have any hope of duplicating the success you had. End quote.
Yeah, and it is really interesting because I think, you know, as much as like the death of Optimus Prime is an iconic thing in that film, that is sort of, I think in the longer term has made it like an enduring part of people's kind of memories, and it's one of the reasons why people are so sort of fascinated by the film. I think from a point of view of what Hasbro wanted, it was absolutely a failure. Like, I didn't really care about Ultra Magnus. I had a Hot Rod toy, but I didn't care about Rodimus Prime as a leader. And, you know, and of course then they just brought back a new improved Optimus Prime in the end, which I think kind of speaks volumes. You know, they never brought back Megatron. You know, he was done and dusted as far as G1 goes, because, yeah, I had the Galvatron toy. He was pretty cool. He made pew-pew laser sounds and had a light-up barrel, which, you know, also probably swayed my, like, 6-year-old purchasing decision. That was a Christmas present. That was great. I think my parents got a headache that Christmas because just running around making pew sounds with my Galvatron. But anyway, I digress. But yeah,
imagine them trying to buy you the Galvatron. They're like, what the heck's a Galvatron?
I mean, credit, like, you know, credit where it is due to my mum. Like, you know, she came and saw Transformers the movie with me, and I've never asked her what that experience was like. I should have asked her before this podcast. Like, what was that like as your first experience of actually watching any Transformers? Did you even pay attention? But yeah, because, you know, she had to be on the ball of like, okay, well, this is the toy that Andrew wants. So, like, you know, duly noted. But yeah, like, you know, the replacement Autobot leaders were never really of any interest to me, and I think it's almost a weird thing where, like, I feel like they painted themselves into the corner by making Optimus Prime so awesome, because, like, he is, again, it's why that character has endured through, you know, into the Michael Bay movies and has become like a sort of the stuff of legend, and like Peter Cullen likewise, because it was just this perfect confluence of the perfect character, this really great character design, perfect voice, like everything about it was just like exactly what you want like a sort of leader of the good guys to be. And you can't just really replicate that. And I mean, you know, Ultra Magnus felt like a boring kind of knockoff of Optimus Prime, which is now sort of almost this kind of spoof in, like, you know, the modern comics where Ultra Magnus is just, nobody pays attention to him because he's just incredibly boring, and everyone's just like, yeah, whatever. Like he's just a pen pusher, really, who does all the paperwork. And like I remember a couple of the Dreamwave comics I've read where he's just like the really finickety, like, don't litter in the corridors guy, basically. Not this kind of big imposing leader, but just the really annoying, like, Ultra Magnus has a problem. What do you want, Ultra Magnus? What have we done wrong? Did we leave the toilet seat up? That kind of thing, which is just so different from Optimus Prime. And then Rodimus Prime, they did interesting things with him, and I think we'll see in the cartoon in season 3 and in the comics. But it was never, in a weird way, he was almost more like the punk rock Optimus Prime, in that he wasn't just like natural born leader, which I think is interesting to me as a grown up, but less so as a kid. And so it was just like, yeah, he has a pretty cool truck mode, I guess, but he also looks a bit like a camper van. So I think I'm still more of an Optimus Prime guy.
Not to sort of delve into the movie story yet, specifically, as it were, and our thoughts on it, but just to echo what you were saying about Ultra Magnus, from my point of view, I vividly remember when I first saw the film, Ultra Magnus's first line in the film, I think it's after Blur says something for the first time as well, and you've got Blur, who's really hyperactive, talking really, really fast, which I can't replicate, and then he's asking, what do you want me to do? And Ultra Magnus says, in the slowest way possible, Blur, go and do this. And it was just that thing of, oh man, like, the heck? You're a leader? That was kind of my first thought, honestly.
Yeah, he is just like Pound Shop Optimus Prime. I mean, ironically, even his toy, like, I don't know if you ever saw, like, the Ultra Magnus toy, but, like, basically, like, the main bit of it is literally a white version of Optimus Prime that you can transform and, like, slot into a bigger figure that becomes Ultra Magnus. So even that, like, as a kid you looked at it, it's like, well, that's just like an Optimus Prime that you slap into another thing. I'm like, that's not very interesting either.
So, after following on from that Ron Friedman quote, just to add to this, because he knew that with what he was saying and what we've just been talking about, that the audience, primarily kids, let's call it like it is, weren't used to seeing death in the show. So when it comes to removing Optimus Prime, killing him off, this was going to be such a big culture shock to them, quite frankly. And because of how the multitude of characters have been developed, like we've just been talking about, and like we've established ourselves, having been rewatching them throughout this podcast run, it's just going to be such a weird feeling of response from the audience in the cinema. And also, makes you wonder as well if maybe he kind of thought inside, I don't want to be a parent taking their kid to this film.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly, I've been trying to kind of like piece together my memories. The weird thing is, like, there are movies that I saw as a kid where I can remember all of my emotional responses to it. And like I was thinking literally before coming on this, like the one I remember most, like, emotionally, is Flight of the Navigator. Like, I can remember the hype I had of that. I remember I was pretty fucking hyperactive after that film when I got out of the cinema. Again, probably a bit of a nightmare to, like, for my parents, because that film was amazing to me. Transformers the movie, weirdly, I can't remember whether I cried when Optimus Prime died. I think I did, but I can't actually recall it. And I feel like that film, maybe it was because it was so important to me, like, and again, this is sort of, this is an era before, you had, like, streaming, and you had, like, oh, this will be on, like, Netflix in a couple of weeks. This was like, you might never get to see this again. And I mean, obviously it came out on VHS and stuff, but it's like, this might be the only time you ever see this thing. And so I think, like, my brain more just, like, absorbed the film in its entirety and then kind of, like, processed it later, rather than actually, like, watching it and being in the moment. Because I could, like, relive that film in my head even as a kid, like, at the drop of a hat, even when I'd only seen it, like, maybe twice after I'd seen it on VHS. But I can't remember, like, emotionally how I took to it. I'm pretty sure I shed a tear over Optimus Prime dying, but I feel like that is more like because of the staging of that scene than the actual events, to be honest, which, we can get into.
Now, knowing, this being Ron Friedman I'm referring to, knowing what he was working with, and based on the quote that I read a few moments ago, and the likely reaction from fans, this is how the concept of Prime's essence, ideologies, and values values, would be transcended within the matrix of leadership to the next leader, which ultimately would be chosen by the matrix itself. So at least he had the wherewithal to figure out a way of going, how the hell do I effectively tell people Prime's still here, if you really think about it?
Yeah. Well, and again, I think this was specific to the UK version, because obviously the UK version didn't come out until December. Like I mean, again, unbeknownst as kids, like before the internet, you didn't realize other kids were getting to watch this film before you. Otherwise, there would have been riots. But it came out in December, and I believe they recorded additional voiceover from Deep Voice Guy.
They did. Because I have a note about that, so I can actually read it in its entirety. So,
which very specifically says Optimus Prime will return, which was clearly like a response to that whole reaction to be like, we better say like, hey kids, don't throw your Optimus Prime toys away. Like, can you dry your eyes before you leave the cinema, please?
So before we get into the film's story itself, let's delve into a couple of other bits and bobs to begin with. The voice cast. While the original voice cast did return, because of what happened in the story, which as said we'll get into in a few moments, there are new recurring actors who make their debut in the film as well, but because this was a movie and it's a big deal, and quite frankly, Hasbro probably wants to make a hell of a lot of money on this film, they drafted in some big names specifically into this project, the film. There was Judd Nelson, there was Eric Idle, Leonard Nimoy, Robert Stack, Lionel Stander, and Orson Welles. Now, Orson Welles we'll get into in a few moments, because that in itself is actually a fairly, just very, very notable role he played, because it was the last role he ever played. So we'll touch on that in a few moments. The score of the film was composed by Vince DiCola, who I didn't realise this, Andy, because I've never actually looked into it, but I didn't realise the film that he had come off, which got him the job to do this, was Rocky IV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also a really good Vince DiCola soundtrack, by the way. Like I'm a big Vince DiCola booster here, and that's the only thing I know. I have not watched Rocky IV, but I know it has a good soundtrack.
And he had to make the soundtrack mostly using storyboards, and according to the retrospective documentary that's on the 4K Blu-ray that came out last year at the time of recording this, he really goes into like the process of how much fun he had making this soundtrack, and it's really, really cool just to see how much he enjoyed the process. He talked about working with someone and having pretty much every synthesizer known to man in his studio, just specifically for the film, but he enjoyed the process because of how much freedom he had to create it. But also, interestingly as well, he said that, well, he inferred more to the point that he had to make the soundtrack, but because it was just by storyboards, he wasn't working to footage. So ultimately, the editors of the film had to kind of chop bits of his soundtrack to make it fit. Which in itself, when you're just making a piece of music, and he's actually said they did it incredibly well, it's a feat that this really came off as well as it did.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's incredible from both levels, because both in terms of editing and in terms of the composition, like, that soundtrack like fits like a glove to that entire movie. And I mean, ironically, you're talking about being able to replay the film in my head. One of the reasons I was able to do that is, while I'm pretty sure I rented the VHS of Transformers the movie, my main touch point after seeing it in cinemas was the soundtrack on cassette. I can't remember whether I managed to get it like immediately after the film came out or whether it was like a few months, but the soundtrack came out on cassette and vinyl. My dad wouldn't let me own it on vinyl because he didn't want his deck messed up, which is fair. It would probably have ended up with strawberry jam on the needle. He was probably right. Like, as a 40-something man, I still worry about messing up my vinyl player, so it's fair. So I ended up with it on cassette, and literally pretty much every weekend I would usually wake up before my parents. I would go down, slap some headphones on, and listen to the Transformers the movie soundtrack, and I would relive the film through that soundtrack, and just enjoy that soundtrack because I still think it's phenomenal and one of the greatest soundtracks of all time. And I think that's kind of, there aren't many films that I could point to where I could be like, hey, listen to this soundtrack and you're basically hearing the film, but that's the case here, and it's kind of incredible.
The soundtrack itself featured songs by Stan Bush, notably The Touch and Dare. Weird Al Yankovic did a song on it, which was Dare to Be Stupid. There, of course, is Lion's epic version of the Transformers opening, and that's the only way to describe it, epic. And there was also a band, Andy. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there is a band called Spectre General that contributed a few songs to this. Are you aware that's not actually their band name?
Yeah, they had to change it, I believe, because they didn't want the kids to know what the real band were all about.
They were called Kick Axe, AXE.
Yeah, which is ironic. I mean, given the Transformers had no trouble using phrases like Deceptibum and other kind of
Booby.
And other alliterations to stuff like. In fact, I'm sure they even explicitly referenced kicking ass or something very close to it in the cartoon, and yet somehow that was their tipping point of oh no, gotta change your name. But hey ho.
Now, did you know that their name was changed on the soundtrack without their permission?
Yeah, I remember. I mean, and it's because that was my first question when I first heard about that. It's well, why would they? Because the whole point of getting on a film soundtrack like that is you want your name to get out there. So once your name's been changed, then what's even the point? And then, the other shoe dropped and oh, nobody actually asked them. They just did it.
Now, a final note before we get on to the actual film itself, Andy. Did you know that the song The Touch was originally offered for Sylvester Stallone's film Cobra before it was placed in Transformers?
I didn't know it was for that film specifically. I did know it had been offered up somewhere else, which kind of makes sense. I think when you sort of really listen to it, it's it works for Transformers, but it's very much, it does almost feel a little bit like it was perhaps penned for another film.
So from there, everyone, let's get on to the movie itself. Now, the way we're going to do this is, credit to the TF Wiki on this, I will say up front. We're basically going to sort of use their synopsis to help carry us through, and then we're going to add our thoughts as we go along on bits and bobs of what we see, because it's probably the most concise way of doing it. Otherwise, we will be here all day, quite frankly. Now, the first thing I want to note, Andy, is, just quite frankly, so, get my thoughts together here. I mentioned that I have watched this very recently, obviously in preparation for the film. I got a chance to check out the 4K UHD Blu-ray for the first time, and oh my god, does this film look incredible in 4K UHD.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, it was the thing that I was sort of excited about when they brought out the final Blu-ray edition, the 30th anniversary version, because my first thought is, especially when I watched some of the extras, were oh, we've rescanned it in 4K. It's oh, have you? Then you could see where that was going, and my first thought watching that 4K scan on Blu-ray was, if they just add HDR to this, it's gonna look amazing, and it does. It's a shame there are a few scenes and a few shots where you can see the cell quality and the film quality is not good enough to look really good in 4K, and those moments stand out. But generally speaking, it's an incredibly crisp transfer. Because of the way this film uses its kind of lighting and, again, good old-fashioned cell animation and the cool kind of tricks and techniques you can use to have interesting lighting effects all look amazing when you add an HDR grading to it. And so, this is the definitive way to watch the film. I'm sure there'll be an 8K version at some point. We'll probably get a Dolby Vision version next up for the 40th anniversary, maybe. But yeah, this is everything you could ask for, really. I kind of wish that they'd had the extra time and budget to clean up some of those slightly rougher shots, but they're pretty few and far between, and most of the film is just jaw-droppingly beautiful.
Yeah, and the opening scene, which I'm going to get onto now, I think is a perfect encapsulation of how damn beautiful this film looks.
Yeah, and that's the thing, even for kind of kids me, in December 86 watching this in the cinema, as I mentioned, there's a lot of the Transformers cartoon I hadn't watched, but I'd seen a decent amount of it. I knew what the Transformers looked like, I knew what that cartoon looked like, and I just remember being blown away by those opening shots of just like the detail, like as Unicron kind of whooshes past the camera, and it kind of like, you get that close up of all the like panels of his body and all the kind of intricate like metal work and detailing there, and then you kind of get to see his innards, which is a weird thing to say on a podcast. But
we saw Megatron's innards,
There's a lot of innards in this film. And you get all of that stuff, and then you get that shot, at the end of his sort of, initial bit of planet devouring, where all the lights around kind of like, the orbit of him all light up, and you get that cool little blah effect, and like all of that just looks so amazing. And I remember as a kid that was the kind of like, Transformers can look like this. What? And again, of course, like not understanding, how the animation industry worked at the time, was like, I was almost a bit annoyed of like, well, why doesn't it always look like this? Why does it not always look this amazing? And that was my thing throughout the film of like, look at all the detail on these characters, look at all the lighting effects. Why does normal cartoon Transformers look a bit flat compared to this?
Yeah, I think it's on the commentary track, which I didn't get a chance to watch all of, admittedly, before we recorded this, but I have watched the film twice before this. Both like the 4K version and just like the regular full frame version. But I think it's Nelson Shin, who I think was one of the directors of the film. Yeah. He points out like the different kind of shading that's used throughout this film compared to the regular series, and that just adds so much additional detail in and of itself. But then you add in the ridiculous animation quality from Toei Animation on this film, and this is just a masterpiece of animation, quite frankly.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I'm glad that people are kind of coming back to this film like all these years later and sort of rewriting the record a bit, because there was definitely a period in time where this film got written off as just like, oh, it's just a bunch of trashy animation, it was just a cheap, cartoon toy shoveling affair, and writing it off in every extent. And I've always been one of the people that will stand up and argue and be like, no, this film looks really good. This is a very well animated film. And it's like, even I feel like compared to the G.I. Joe movie, which has an incredible opening scene. Which
it's probably ridiculous.
Which like that bests anything that Transformers the movie can do. I will give it that. But I think the rest of that film is kind of like, yeah, that's all right. It looks fine. But like Transformers the movie, over the course of its runtime, like has so many fantastic bits of animation that we will get through as we go, that it is a very well animated piece. And like it's really interesting, because it could have been a very cheap knockoff, we'll just make it look exactly like the cartoon and we'll just knock it out. But whether it was because they felt like it was going to be a big thing, whether it was just a labour of love on behalf of the animation staff, I don't know. But either way, it is a terrific looking film, and it stands up even now to me that it looks really good for the most part.
The film begins with a giant mechanical-looking planet travelling through the depths of space, attacking a metal planet which has robotic inhabitants. Robots, vehicles, buildings, and even large chunks of rock are sucked off the surface and devoured by this monstrous planet. This entire opening sequence, Andy, you could just use this as a trailer for the film. And you could just almost show it as like a teaser. Like, imagine seeing that in the cinema before you're watching something else, and you're like, what the hell was that? I need to know. That in itself is just an incredible opening sequence.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating kind of like opening, because, I mean, for starters, obviously, I mean, I guess from like some of the promotional material, as a kid, you maybe knew a little bit about Unicron as a thing. But like, you're introduced to this big metallic planet that you know nothing about. You're introduced to this other world which you know nothing about, which again, talk about setting the dark tone of this. Like, we get to see kids running around playing moments before they are just, devoured and killed. And it's just like, and that's the kind of thing, I guess, that passes you by as a kid, but as a grown-up, you're just like, oh my god, they're really laying this on thick of just like, all of this is about to go horribly wrong.
Yeah, it's the spectacle of it as well, which kind of almost catches you off guard, because you're about to watch the film, but this is just such a ridiculous thing you're watching, but the spectacle is incredible, and it's only after you suddenly think, wait, a crap load of people, an entire planet just got devoured. I saw literal blood flying around inside of something. What the heck just happened?
Yeah. And again, I mean, talking about the soundtrack, like, Unicron's theme is a really good sort of ominous sort of rumbling below all of that, is a really good introduction to that character and what you're getting into here. That's just like, oh my god, there's some serious business. There's stuff at stake here, and weirdly, you think about it, after that opening scene, no Unicron for quite a while in this film. Like, it sort of gets forgotten and backgrounded until suddenly it's like, oh yeah, the big planet that eats things.
Exactly, because after we get the opening credits, this effectively becomes what I'm gonna call the conclusion of the pre-movie timeline. For about the next half an hour, we effectively get the biggest budget regular episode of Transformers ever at this point. Mm-hmm. This is what we get.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think ultimately, like, they did cut this down for TV into like 4 episodes, if I recall. And there is at least at one point where it fades out in a way that is just like almost end of part 1, and then it sort of resumes again. But yeah, like it's just like back to your regularly scheduled programming of Autobots versus Decepticons.
Now, one of the big parts about the film is the fact that we were in the year 1986, but come the film, we fast forwarded in time and we're now in the year 2005. And not counting the UK version of the opening, which we'll get onto once we've got through the entire film, Andy, because I think it's worth bringing it up at that point. But the narrator says the following. It is the year 2005. The treacherous Decepticons have conquered the Autobots' home planet of Cybertron. But from secret staging grounds on 2 of Cybertron's moons, valiant Autobots prepare to retake their homeland. You're seeing visuals of Cybertron and whatnot, and that really just lays the groundwork for, oh man, a lot has happened. What was it at this point? 19 years later in the story? If I've done my maths right quickly. But you know what doesn't change after 19 years, Andy? When we see Laserbeak flying through the sky, just getting inside Autobot HQ on the moon, and just looking at stuff. Nothing changes after 19 years.
Laserbeak still doing the business. But yeah, again, I mean, I remember as a kid, even that was kind of a crazy moment where it just casually introduces like, oh, by the way, Decepticons have won, basically. It's just like, they've taken over Cybertron, like Autobots on the back foot, just kind of hiding out on the moons. And I remember as a kid, it was like a bit of a 1-2 punch of like, one, it's the year 2005, and you're just like, whoa, 2005, that's never going to happen. Like, am I even going to be around in 2005? That's so far away. And it's like, here we are, like 2020 something. And so, you have that, and your child brain is just getting over that. And it's like, oh, by the way, the Decepticons have taken over Cybertron. I'm like, whoa, hang on a minute. Strap yourself in. And so, again, just as a start, even just as a bit of narration, that's just mind-blowing of just like, okay, very different from the Transformers that I'm used to.
So as mentioned, the Decepticons are now in control of Cybertron. The Autobots are preparing to launch an assault to retake the planet from the hidden bases of Cybertron's 2 moons. Which, first time we've ever seen them, Andy. I didn't think anything of it, but there was a part of, were there moons on by Cybertron? Were there in the series? I'm pretty sure there weren't, but I digress. The Autobots launch a shuttle to pick up the final shipment of Energon from Earth before they are going to strike. Now, I mentioned Laserbeak. Plans for the attack are overheard by little Laserbeak, who reports back to Megatron. The Decepticons then attack the shuttle en route to Earth. And this is where the tone of the movie is firmly established. Because they don't just barge in and, take over the ship and maybe throw people in the brig. No, they flat out murder people. Megatron turns into his gun, and I think it's Starscream just literally shoots Ironhide, Prowl, Ratchet, and Brawn. The latter 3 in particular being offed in one shot. Ironhide is kind of the one Autobot left who kind of grabs Megatron's foot and is like, you won't win! And then I think Megatron... Did I write down his exact quote?
His retort is just such heroic nonsense and just blasts him to his clear death at his feet. Which again, as a kid, that was that I think that was actually the moment that really set it into my brain of like, this film is going hard, because it's just like, okay, that looked pretty bad for those characters, you know, that didn't look pleasant. But that moment where you have sort of like kind of almost dying gasp already Ironhide being like, you know, trying his final valiant attempt to stop him, and Megatron not even flinching, just like firing his laser down at his fusion cannon down at his feet, was just like, oh no. And again, I mean, interesting for this scene is Vince DiCola like wrote a track for this scene himself, but this was one that ended up being like one of the Spectre General songs, and I think it's the one place where actually it works better than the Vince DiCola track to have that there, because it's kind of it's quite a punchy accompaniment to everything going on. Instruments of Destruction.
There you go. I do want to give a shout out to Megatron, because on the scene earlier where Laserbeak returned to Megatron to report what, you know, they'd seen, Megatron's line of, "Welcome, Laserbeak. Unlike some of my other warriors, you never fail me." And then it cuts to Starscream. It's just...
Yeah, who has a really good surprised face of just like, what, me? Okay.
Just such a wonderful moment. So, at this point, and I'm going to do my best to see if I can somehow keep this up, Andy, the fatality list has 4 people on it.
Mm-hmm.
Has 4 Autobots on it. Now, at this point, we're now going to Earth. The Decepticons are able to get very close to the base because of the shuttle. And we discover they are heading to Autobot City, which we've never seen before. And it's giant. But before this, we get to see 2 new characters. That being Daniel, who turns out is the son of Spike. And we see Hot Rod, and they're fishing. And this is... I really, really liked this introduction to these 2. It kind of established that they're friends and whatnot. It also made, I think, Hot Rod almost unlikable from the get-go, because when he's suddenly catching a fish and he's like, "Whoa, look, it's a fish! Whoa!" kind of thing. I'm just like, oh, mate, like, no, this is not... Whoever you are, I don't know what you're doing, but no. But then they start heading up to the mountain because they get a signal saying the shuttle is coming, and that's when Dare starts. Soundtrack, and they just start driving through. They barge past Cup, I think it was, building a roadblock. It's a wonderful introduction to Cup as a character as well. I love this scene so much. Just when the music is going, it's perfect. But then, from there, they notice that there is a hole in the side of the ship. Well, more to the point, Daniel notices, and he hasn't even got binoculars on, quite frankly. It's like, damn, son, you got some good eyesight there in the year 2005. And then, this is when the battle begins. Gonna pause there for a second, Andy, because I want to give you a chance to talk about this scene before we get to carnage and mayhem and whatnot. What do you think of this opening introduction to these 3 characters?
Yeah, well first of all, can we reach a concord that Dare is actually a better song than The Touch?
So, do you know what? I was going to bring this up later. I have always been a guy who is like, The Touch, it reigns supreme. But in watching the film this time, I have gained a whole new appreciation for Dare, and I do think it is a superior song. I still love The Touch to bits, that will never change.
Yeah.
But there is just a thing about Dare where it just amps you up so much.
Yeah. I mean, they are both great songs, but Dare has always been like my go-to there. And yeah, like the way it launches into that song, and yeah, like, you know, getting... Hot Rod, somehow, like, seeing his car mode is always just like, that's pretty cool. Like, that's why I ended up with, like, the Hot Rod toy. He was one of those very much more like, I just want him for the car mode because it's pretty cool. And you get hoverboards because it's 2005. And as we know, hoverboards were, you know, all the kids had them by 2005.
What year was Back to the Future set in, or was that 2015? I can't remember.
That was, like, 2000 Oh, maybe it was 2016 or something. I can't remember.
Maybe. But either way, there were hoverboards according to Back to the Future by that point, so...
yeah, absolutely. But yeah, this is really good. I mean, all of this stuff kind of, you know, prior to sort of space shenanigans is all like a really good introduction to Hot Rod's character. Because he is kind of a bit of a jerk through a lot of the early going here. Like, you know, even him like tearing past Cup, it's like, come on, man, he's on your side. And like, you know, you almost brained him just because you were in a hurry to go somewhere. And he has lots of very kind of like arrogant or sort of impetuous one-liners, which obviously, you know, leads into some events later on. But yeah, this is this is cool. This is a good intro, and yeah, like the whole like there's a hole in the shuttle thing. I don't know, it's one of those scenes that is just really cool to me. Like especially because Hot Rod has his like optical zoom that he looks at and is just like, oh, you're right, and just starts firing, which again, really well animated shot of just like a couple of shots like bounce off the hull, like knock Starscream over on his backside, which is really good. And then you've got Cut being like, what the hell is he doing? And then suddenly it's like, oh, we have a problem. And like that whole thing is a really good lead into what is about to go down.
So at this point, we get the surprise attack. We get a who's who of Decepticon and Autobots just basically starting to have an all-out war. This is when you realise, Andy, crap, man, this is it. Like, whatever is going to happen, this is the freaking battle now. We've got 19 years later, this is the deciding battle. I also want to give a shout-out immediately to Cup single-handedly taking out both Blitzwing and Shrapnel.
Yeah, and that again, there's so many little moments that I found so incredibly cool as a kid and still do now. And like again, the animation really carries it, where like Cup like drives over to where Blitzwing is, kind of swings around on his turret, like and then just pulls his turret up so that he misses Hot Rod, and it's like, that's just so cool. Did you see the thing he just did? That was so cool. Mm-hmm. And there are so many moments like in this kind of in and around this battle in particular, which again is just like perfect like music versus what's going on screen, but it has so many really awesome little moments like that. And then like the fact that Blitzwing and Shrapnel, I mean I assume there are clones involved here, because the Shrapnels have a pretty bad day in this one. It's got to be said.
The other thing as well, which I think it's a very interesting note, and it goes back to like the tonal shift that we were mentioning earlier. You hear the word die or inferring of being killed a heck of a lot. Like, there's outright, like, let the slaughter begin, I think is a line from someone, like, just die Autobots. And that tonal shift, again, this is really being established in here. And that's why I do remember the first time I watched it, I was like, oh man, like, this is the final battle. Even though I probably knew there was a season 3, it's like, oh man, like, this is happening. It's all going down.
And again, this is one of the things that has really struck me. This viewing coming off the back of seasons 1 and 2, where you notice that almost quite subtle in places change of language, because again, if you look in the comics, you'll see words like die and exterminate from like the Decepticons quite a lot, but in the cartoon, you're right, it never really veers that far. I think it maybe does like once or twice, but it certainly suddenly you're talking about slaughter and using all the big violent words, and like it's very much setting its tone right there.
It's also during this battle that we are first introduced to RC and Springer as well, who will become pivotal characters in this story as well. I also just want to sort of just touch on a few various things before we get to the inevitable big climactic battle here, Andy. First of all, when Blaster's in like the control tower and like Perceptor goes to find him to say, can you get a message to Prime to come and help us? Blaster's line of dialogue is, hey Perceptor, what's shaking other than this fortress? I think one of the things that I loved about this film, which I'll be saying a lot if you haven't noticed already during this podcast, is like there is so much good dialogue in it. Like there's we've had all sorts of good one-liners throughout like our run of this podcast so far, but like they really knock it out the park with line after line. It's like even Perceptor, when he like announces that the Decepticons are attacking, it's like what was a cursory evaluation of our tactical capabilities indicate a serious disadvantage or something, and like Ultramax is just like, which means, but yeah, and like all of Blaster's stuff here is like, when he puts out the message, it's like, cover your receptors, Perceptor, which is just like, that's a good line. And even, it shows how much I love this film. Even the noises his control panel makes and the buttons he taps is just so satisfying, watching him just quickly like tap in like, I don't know, like the
whatever the direct phone number to Optimus Prime's mobile is, to be like, hey, can you send some help, please?
The Transformers equivalent of the Bat phone from the 60s Batman show.
yeah, and it's just like, and even from that, it's like, you know, I forget the exact quote, but it's just like, we're really taking a pounding, and it's just like, it's just all so good.
Now, talking about Blaster, actually, we also get the debut of his cassette tapes, which I totally forgot were a thing until I watched it in preparation for this. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, the names are Eject, Rewind, Steeljaw, and Ramhorn or Ramjawn?
Yeah.
Because I've got a weird autocorrect on my screen. I'm pretty sure Ramjawn is not a correct name.
No, I think it might be Ramjaw. I forget. But yeah, like everybody always forgets about Blaster's tapes because they're just like less, especially when they get to like, you know, Eject and Rewind. It's just like, you just made a couple of dudes. Like, they're not as cool as Rumble and Frenzy. But that whole scene is really cool of like, you know, we then get on to Soundwave's cassettes versus Blaster's cassettes.
And we get Rat-Bat for the first time.
And we get Rat-Bat, yeah, who, you know, not even name checked. It's like, you're you know, burying the lead there. But that's one of those cool, like, you get this little sub battle within like the big battle of just like these little tape decks, just kind of like the little cassette tapes, just like, you know, having a little rumble to you know, use the obvious joke.
Now, another thing that we see during this is when Springer and RC are being tasked with making the base like transform into, I guess, like defense mode effectively. During this is when we come to find out there have been 2 more fatalities, that being Windcharger and Wheeljack, who are just dead. There's no other way to put it. I think RC's trying to like help Windcharger's body or something, and I think Springer effectively goes, look, you've got to leave them. Like, they're gone.
Yeah. And again, I mean, that was a crazy moment for me tonally, you know. I mean, I think that was probably one of the ones that hit me hardest as a kid, was like, oh, not Wheeljack. Like, you know, I loved Wheeljack. He was great. And then, you know, doesn't even get a proper kind of, you know, noble death. He's just there, just wrecked. But yeah, just seeing like RC just basically kind of trying to drag the bodies around. And it's just like, this kid's cartoon, man. Like, what is going on here? So yeah, that stuff is all crazy. And this is also something that kind of confused me a little bit as a kid, because I'm 99% sure that I owned Metroplex at this point, who was the Autobot city that transformed into a big robot. So when they said they were going to transform Autobot cities, like, bang, Metroplex, great, let's do this. And then no, apparently this is a different Autobot city that doesn't transform into a big-chested robot. And I was that was one of my few disappointments watching this film as a kid, of just like, no, but Metroplex, like, Metroplex would have kicked everybody's ass in this film. So why have we got this lesser Autobot city?
I honestly don't remember, because it's been so long since I've seen anything like past the movie either, but in context, it almost makes me wonder if this battle is what then creates Metroplex. I don't remember or know for sure off the top of my head.
It might well be, because yeah, like, Metroplex is definitely in like season 3, and because then you get the I always forget the name of like the Decepticon equivalent of him, but yeah, and like, you know, he definitely kind of crops up in like the Headmasters series and stuff later on the Japan side. So yeah, like, I think it was maybe one of those weird ones where the toy came out at just the wrong time, and I feel like maybe I owned it, or at least knew that I was getting him, or had seen it in brochures just before this film. So I was like, oh, I know what's happening here. And it's like, oh, I don't. That's a shame.
There's a wonderful moment in this scene, and I promise we will move on, people, because I'm also adding a lot of my own thoughts in at this point that I just need to say. But there's a wonderful moment when I think it's Hot Rod, Cup, RC, and Springer are pushing like the rocket launcher into place, because they've all now managed to end up in the same room. And there's a wonderful, it's a little moment, but this adds to the whole, what I've been talking about before, Andy, about the human emotion in Transformers is what I really connect with. And Daniel, he's a freaking little tiny dude. He's trying to help them push this rocket launcher. But just the way it's animated, you can see he's giving it absolutely everything he possibly can. And it's just such a cool moment, just still seeing, even in this ridiculous situation, a human is still trying to help.
Yeah, and it's really striking, because you can see even like the Autobots in the room are struggling to like push this thing around so that they can fire off some rockets, and to see like Daniel join in. And again, I mean, this is much like the discussion we've had around like Spike and Sparkplug, of like human characters that aren't just ciphers for the kid audience to be like, here's the fun kid, don't you wish you were him? Because like Daniel has a bad time in this film. Like, you know, his dad is like, you know, missing, presumed dead for a big chunk of it. You know, he gets into some pretty risky situations. Like, you know, he's literally in the midst of, you know, these two groups fighting for their life, and you know, all of this going on, and like, you know, it's really, it feels so different from your average movie where it's just like, look at me, this is fun, I'm a kid doing fun kid stuff, and that works really well. And again, like talking about, you know, use of the word die, as I used up front, like Springer's line of like, I've got better things to do tonight than die, which I believe was ad-libbed. Like, I'm pretty sure I saw like an interview or a documentary where they said they basically, I think it was maybe like the animators had dropped some lip flaps in there, assuming there'd be dialogue, and they hadn't written anything. So like, could just make something up on the spot for that bit when we're recording, and that was what he came out with, and everyone was like, yeah, you just nailed it. And I seem to recall like he said he did it at the time being like, are you guys going to want to cut that? Because, like, that's, you know, death. And, like, no, that's exactly what we want.
It's a bit grim.
It's exactly what we need here.
At this point, if memory serves, this is when Prime's, like, reinforcement shuttle arrives. This is when we get to see the Dinobots come into action, of which, Andy, there's only 4 of them. I'm confused by this, but there were only 4.
Yeah, I guess.
Literally, throughout the entire film, there's only 4, but I'm pretty sure at some point, Swoop just disappears and is replaced by the other one.
I'm blanking on that now. Yeah, I'm just like, oh, cool, Dinobots, and yeah, and of course before that, Devastator is important again. Like, you know, which again is one of those weird continuity things, because you'd have thought you would have had like Bruticus or something, given how he'd been bigged up, but it's like no, and everyone's like Devastator, and it's like 20 years later we're back. Devastator's back on top. He's like the Undertaker of combiner robots or something, where he just never goes away and just keeps becoming the big thing.
So of course, Prime now arrives, and this is when he infers, like, this is the final battle. The touch kicks in, we get Prime's, I think, one of the best sequences involving Optimus Prime ever, when he's rolling along the ground, he transforms, jumps in the air, and does, like, the best sharpshooting you'll ever see while someone's in the air, and then it ends up getting to Megatron, and then we get the dialogue exchange of Prime saying, "One shall live, one shall fall." Megatron responding with, "Why throw away your life so recklessly?" Prime then responding with, "That's a question you should ask yourself, Megatron." And then Megatron just saying, "Now I shall crush you with my bare hands." And holy crap, Andy, this fight between these two. This is literally all the build-up of what will the final battle be between these two. This is everything and then some.
Yeah, I mean, this whole sequence is amazing. Like, Optimus Prime's introduction, like, you couldn't hope for a more kind of incredible sort of statement of intent as he kind of enters the scene. Like, and again, like, the animation, the attention to detail on the animation, like, where he's literally running over Decepticons,
yeah,
which is maybe not a very Optimus Prime-esque thing to do, but like, you see the reflections of those Decepticons like in his radiator grill as he goes and like smashes into them, and then he just blasts off and kind of like 360 no scopes a few Decepticons, and then just fires off a volley of blasts, and it's just like, you know, it's your perfect like TikTok clip of why Optimus Prime is awesome. And then like, you get into the battle with Megatron, which again, I mean, there's been some pretty like hardcore fights between those two in the cartoon, but this is really brutal. It's like, you know, Prime takes some damage to his torso, and then you just see Megatron deliberately targeting it over and over again just to like amp up and amplify the damage in that part of his body. And like, it's really rough, like, you know, and the whole thing, and, you know, like, Megatron kind of, you know, grappling, it's like, "I'll rip out your optics," and all of those kind of moments, you know, it's really crazy, and it has a really good back and forth to it, where, like, you know, obviously you can only watch this film for the first time once, but you have that, like, who's going to win here? Like it has this really good back and forth where you're like, oh no, Prime's got this, and it's like, oh no, he hasn't. And like, oh no, okay, he's turned it around again. This is fine. And then you spy the gun tucked away under a rock, and you're like, oh, now I know what's going to happen here.
You see, it was interesting because it's been so long since I saw the film, I legitimately didn't remember how this battle ended the way it did. I obviously knew what the final result was going to be, but there was just that thing of, how does this battle even end? And then when you see the gun, you instantly go, oh man, like, damn you, Megatron, feigning that you want to be, like, have mercy on you. Then, of course, the other part I had completely forgotten about, Andy, is Hot Rod. When he comes in and he gets in the way, just seeing this unfold and then Prime getting shot and whatnot, there's just this moment of, you're trying to introduce the new leader of the Autobots by the end of this film. And the way you're introducing him is by effectively have him be the reason that Optimus Prime is dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really brave narrative decision, and like it's you know, again, really interesting when you watch this film, you know, beyond the kind of the first time or two, that all of the foreshadowing around Hot Rods that you get, you know, which is actually, none of it is particularly subtle when you actually look at it, but when you watch it for the first time, you don't really see exactly where it's going with it necessarily, and it also made me think, like, you know, one of the interesting things watching it this time around, having watched all of season 2, and like, you know, having seen Optimus Prime's origin as like stoner surfer dude, as I call him, Orion Pax, like, you know, you kind of, there's a really interesting parallel there, because Hot Rod is kind of that character as well, where he's like the young upstart know-it-all kid who everyone else is just like, oh, Hot Rod, like, don't stop being an idiot, like, you know, grow up a bit. And, you know, this is kind of a perfect example of that, where he's just impetuous, and kind of in a way he's doing the right thing, because he realizes that Megatron's trying to pull one over on Prime, but, you know, ends up getting in the way inadvertently. And it's yeah, like, as a kid it was just like, oh, well, it's all your fault, isn't it? But also, like, it's a really interesting kind of part of his character that I found really interesting watching it compared to the Orion Pax stuff we saw, of just like, okay, there's sort of a bit of a through line here that the series is going for.
But one thing that doesn't change, Andy, no matter the Transformers episode or movie, is we get a traditional Decepticon retreat. Except this one feels a lot more heavy-handed, I'll say, than other ones. Because you get the moment where Megatron's downed as well, and Starscream just kind of walks up to him and just says, this was a quote, "How does it feel, mighty Megatron?" and just kicks him.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, not even a little nudge with the toe of like, let's see what you're doing, like a proper boot into the stomach, kind of like, ha. Yeah, which is, you know, a great Starscream moment, and I'm just glad that his foot is okay after earlier in that battle,
which is shoot it from being caught.
My favorite Starscream moment from this film, where he's kind of like chasing down, I forget which Autobots it is, and
it was RC and Springer, I think.
It was RC and Springer, that's right, yeah. And then he kind of realizes, as Autobot City's transforming around him, he tries to escape that transformation so he doesn't get trapped, but his foot gets trapped, and he has to basically shoot his own foot to open it up, and just says, "Ah, my foot," which is second only to my favourite line in the film. Actually, there are quite a few favourite lines, but is where like the Insecticons are kind of trying to eat through the doors to get inside Autobot City, as Hot Rod and Cup are kind of trying to make their way back there, and Cup says, the Insecticons are in our way, and Hot Rod's like, no, they're our way in, and they just like, Kickback just gets literally crushed, his head just gets squashed, and they both just like kind of blast through and drive past, which is a really cool little moment. But yeah, like you know, we used to Megatron being defeated, but man, that's a long fall. Like, I feel like I still wince when I see him fall down at like multiple stories of like the wreckage of Autobot City and just come crashing down in a heap. It's like, ooh, that looked painful, and it was, as it turned out.
And then further reinforced as well after that kick from Starscream, when Starscream's told everyone, right, let's go, find Astro Train, we're all leaving, and we're just going to leave Megatron. And then Megatron just says, "Don't leave me, Soundwave." And then Soundwave, being the honourable man, at this point in the film, that he is, just says, "As you command, Megatron," and picks him up, and you get this wonderful, very surreal moment of Megatron's body just being carried by Soundwave, and then Rumble following on with his arm cannon, which is just funny.
Yeah. That is really good. A really nice little bit of attention to detail of just like, oh yeah, better take the gun as well, I guess.
So now, Andy, we come to arguably one of the most scarring scenes in children's cartoon history. Optimus Prime's death. He's lying literally on his deathbed. He passes the reins of the leadership to Ultra Magnus, giving him the matrix of leadership. Though, as Prime is trying to give it to him, he drops it and Hot Rod sort of accidentally touches it, and we get like a massive light show moment from that. Now, within all of this, we kind of get the following dialogue mentioned. There's Daniel saying, "Prime, you can't die." And then Prime says, "Do not grieve. Soon I shall be one with the Matrix. Ultra Magnus, it is to you, old friend. I shall pass the Matrix of leadership as it was passed to me." Magnus then responds with, "Prime, I'm just a soldier. I'm not worthy." Prime then responds with, "Nor was I. But one day, an Autobot shall rise from our ranks and use the power of the Matrix to light our darkest hour. Until that day, till all are one." And after taking out the Matrix from his chest and Hot Rod catching it like I mentioned, Prime's vitals fade. Magnus at this point has put the Matrix into his chest as well. And then you get just the most harrowing thing, Andy, because they really wanted to reinforce in this film that Prime is dead. His vitals fade on the computer. His eyes go dark. His body turns grey. And just to rub it in some more, almost like just twisting a knife in the stomach, you see Prime's head just tilt to the side. Like,
yeah,
he's dead. He's deader than dead. He's gone.
Yeah, it is really brutal because, they could have left it as just like the vital signs fade to nothing. Like, everybody knows what that means. Like, that's like the well-worn in media thing that you focus on, like, the ECG, like the output, and then it flatlines and, they're gone. And that's how you do it in media. You don't then linger on the body as it sort of finally fades away. But no, that's what we do in this kid's cartoon. And it is incredible. Like, and it is, it is a very well crafted scene. Like, again, musically, fantastically well done. Right the way through to that moment where Hot Rod catches the Matrix and you get this sort of like moment, which is really good. And yeah, like all of that musically is really good. And as the vital signs fade, you get this kind of this rising little crescendo that then just drops, and it's musically it's so good. Again, really weird little touches that don't need to be there on the animation side. Like Ultra Magnus puts the Matrix in his chest. It's like, that's just not quite comfy. He just takes it out, puts it back in again a bit more snugly. And it's like, they spent like probably an extra couple of days like animating those cells just to do that. And that's really cool. But yeah, like it's a really well crafted scene, but man, do they really hammer home, like you said, what the intent of that scene is. And then of course you get to see Daniel crying, you get to see, and by the way, it's not just you in the cinema here, like here's Daniel crying as well.
How else can we reinforce this is an actual thing? Here's the little kid crying.
yeah, it's crazy.
So now, also worth noting that the sequence of events is observed, not absurd, sorry. It is kind of absurd, but they are observed by Unicron remotely. And this is the next time we see him, Andy. This is how long it's been at this point since we saw him in the opening scene. Now, the Decepticons are making their escape aboard Astro Train, but all of their weight combined is just too heavy for Astro Train to be able to get them home under his own power. This is when Starscream says the following. "Fellow Decepticons, Astro Train has requested that we light our burden." And then Bone Crusher of the Decepticons says, "In that case, I say it's survival of the fittest." Starscream says, "Do I hear a second on that?" And I think it's Soundwave and the 3 Cone Seeker Jets say, "Aye!" And then Starscream says, "And against?" and then you see Shrapnel, Bombshell, Kickback, Thundercracker, and Skywarp just kind of go, nay. And then Starscream just says, the eyes have it, and then those 5 Decepticons are just unmercifully just shoved out of the door and are just floating through space. Now, as if that wasn't enough, Starscream is then holding Megatron's body by the door, and he has what I think is still one of the best lines of dialogue in the way it's animated from Starscream ever. He just said, "Oh, how it pains me to do this," with the most maniacal grin on his face.
Yeah, it's this really great smirk of just like, yep, I've won. This is it. This is my moment. And like, yeah, again, a really sort of quite pathetic moment from Megatron, who's just like, I still function, and it's like wanna bet, and boosh, off you go into space.
This scene, it's just. It's that tonal shift in a different way, because we've seen Decepticons fight each other before, but this is on a whole other level, quite frankly, and this is really when it's establishing, oh man, stuff is changing, and is Starscream actually now the leader? And we get like a whole sort of leadership battle type thing in all of this. But now, with the Decepticons out the way, this is when things take the next interesting turn. Megatron and the other Decepticons are adrift, and they encounter Unicron. Unicron... Well, in fact, you know what, Andy? Because I was so captivated with this scene, I actually wrote down all the dialogue. So I want to recite it, because for me, this, from a Megatron character standpoint, really shows how far he has fallen. Just not only from like the start of Transformers as a whole, but just in this film. From going at the start of this film when he's like, they're going to crush them and kill them all today. And this is where he goes to. And by the way, I can't do Orson Welles' voice, but just imagine it's Orson Welles. So you get Unicron saying, "Welcome, Megatron." Megatron saying, "Who said that?" "I am Unicron." "Show yourself." "I have summoned you here for a purpose." Nobody summons Megatron. At this point, Andy, I'm like, dude, you've got a freaking giant planet there. Like, are you kidding me? And then Unicron's response, best response here, is just, "Then it pleases me to be the first." "State your business," says Megatron. "This is my command. You are to destroy the Autobot matrix of leadership. It is the one thing, the only thing, that can stand in my way." Megatron says, "You have nothing to fear. I already crushed Optimus Prime with my bare hands." "You exaggerate," says Unicron. Megatron says, "The point is, he's dead, and the Matrix died with him." Then Unicron responds with, "No. The point is, you are a fool. The Matrix has been passed on to their new leader, Ultra Magnus. Destroy it for me." "Why should I? What's in it for me?" And then Unicron responds with, "Your bargaining posture is highly dubious, but very well. I will provide you with a new body and troops to command." And Megatron, clearly thinking he's got the upper hand here, just goes, "And?"
And nothing.
Literally, "and nothing. You belong to me now." And then Megatron says, "I belong to nobody." And then Unicron just says, "Perhaps I misjudged you. Proceed on your way to oblivion." And then we get this first time effect of like lots of red going about the screen, clearly Unicron having a hold over Megatron of some kind. And the last line that Megatron says in the Transformers is, "No, no, no! I accept your terms! I accept!" And then Unicron just responds with, "Excellent." And so the last line of Megatron in the effectively Megatron in the Transformers, Andy, is him basically becoming someone else's property. It's like, just from a character development standpoint, after all we have watched to this point, it's mind-blowing to see this happen to him, what we have witnessed.
Yeah, and that whole like back and forth again, like, cannot rate the dialogue and the writing in this film highly enough, like compared to the cartoon that comes before it, because that everything about that is great. And I mean, again, that's dialogue that I can just like recite just like that, because all of the lines are so memorable. The back and forth of every time Megatron tries to get an upper hand of just like, hey, like, I'm Megatron, just get slapped down immediately, like, no, you're an idiot, shut up. This is what you're doing. This is how. I do feel Unicron probably foolish to be like, oh, by the way, you need to destroy the Matrix of Leadership because it's the only thing that like can stop me. Like, probably just indoor voice for that. Keep that bit to yourself. Like, just say, I just don't like it very much. The color offends me. Can you just get rid of it?
It's too bright.
It's nothing. It's nothing like dangerous to me. It's just not my thing. Can you just destroy it because of that? Not like this is the thing that could destroy me, because that's maybe a bad ploy. But yeah, it's a really great thing. I mean, again, how much of this was Orson Welles and how much of it was Leonard Nimoy being Orson Welles is open to debate, but like, it's really well delivered. And then again, another mind blown as a kid moment when we get to see Megatron's transformation into Galvatron and how that is animated, and this was very much the scene that racked up my parents' wallets in terms of toys that I wanted, because it's like, you get Galvatron, it's like, oh, he looks really cool, and then you get Cyclonus, like, he looks really cool, and then you've got like Scourge and the Sweeps, is like, less cool, but I still want them. And it's like, and I ended up owning all of those toys. So this scene was probably, responsible of like getting Hasbro about like 40 to 50 quid of like 1986 money, just in like 30 seconds. So people talk about the effectiveness of this film. Like, I can measure this scene in pounds.
So the weird part about this scene for me, and first of all, I agree, animation-wise, this scene is phenomenal. I love it so much, just from an aesthetic point of view. I remembered that Megatron is reformatted, which is the correct word to use, I think, into Galvatron. I totally did not realise and or forgot that Thundercracker, Shrapnel, Kickback, Bombshell, and Skywarp are also just reformatted. I just thought they died based on memory. I didn't realise we've effectively still got them in the show, which is weird.
Yeah. The Cyclonus and kind of Scourge and the Sweeps are all like just rebooted Transformers. And again, it's sort of you talk about the loss of the leaders, but you think of how much of a staple like Thundercracker is in the G1 cartoon. And the Decepticons, get a fair few appearances, just like, no, all just wiped out, just no more.
So, now, I wrote this down partly from a continuity perspective from our podcast, Andy, but this is how I think the reformatting occurs in terms of who becomes what. Megatron obviously becomes Galvatron. I think it's Thundercracker that becomes Scourge the Tracker, as Unicron calls him. Shrapnel and Kickback become Sweepers, the Huntsman, as Unicron notes. Bombshell becomes Cyclonus, the Warrior. And Skywarp becomes part of Cyclonus's Armada, is how I phrased it. Now, I don't know if Thundercracker and Skywarp are in the right order, because quite frankly, they're not in their colours at that point. They're in reformatting mode. But that was based on me kind of pausing the scene, looking at their positions on the screen, and then seeing how they did or didn't change. It was very awkward, Andy, but that's how I figured it out.
Yeah. I mean, that probably makes sense.
And in Galvatron's first line after he has become Galvatron entirely, and this is Leonard Nimoy saying this, which in itself is a trip. I will rip open Ultra Magnus and every other Autobot until the Matrix has been destroyed. Hearing Spock say that is a trip.
yeah. I mean, Leonard Nimoy does a really good, puts in a really good shift as Galvatron in this film, which again is, if I recall, is sort of to the detriment of season 3, where shock horror he doesn't come back to to be Galvatron back in the mainstream cartoon, because you never quite get that intonation again.
So at this point, you'd think that Galvatron's first stop is going to be, okay, head to Ultra Magnus, Unicron's got some kind of hold over me, let's not aggravate that. No. his first stop is to Cybertron to get revenge by killing Starscream and reclaiming leadership of the Decepticons. I appreciate we're not getting through the story incredibly fast, Andy, but we need to talk about this coronation scene because our podcast namesake here requires it, quite frankly. This coronation scene is so wonderfully bittersweet. Because we finally get to see Starscream crowned. The Constructicons, there you go. They're blowing on the trumpets, and they blow on the trumpets too much. And then they're just ruining Starscream's coronation. He's got the crown. Then Galvatron arrives, and Starscream's first reaction is, Megatron? Is that you? After Galvatron says something to the effect of, like, this is a sham. And then that's when he transforms, and he literally turns Starscream into dust.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible scene, yeah, because it's like Starscream, like, who interrupts my coronation? And he's like, coronation Starscream? This is bad comedy. And he's like, Megatron? And I think he's like, just like, yeah, like, take a guess. And then, yeah, just transforms into his gun mode, which again, like, even more me, like, tugging on my mum's, like, shoulder, just like, see, look, he's got a cool cannon mode, like, this is why I need him for Christmas.
This is the point where your mum's going, okay. Sure.
Yeah, it's like now I see it. Now I see why you need this toy. But yeah, and again, the animation on this, where it's just because we've had some pretty shocking deaths in this film thus far. Quite a few of them. But yeah, Starscream just literally just turns grey and then just disintegrates completely. And it's not because you can make argument for some of those other Transformers. You could be trying to argue it in your head. They might still be alright. Maybe they can be revived. They're at least in one piece. Not Starscream. He's literally just a pile of ashes. And then, again, really great little scene of just like Galvatron just like stomping on that crown, which just like, just sort of buckles under his foot. And then, yeah, it's like, I think it's Rumpa's like, what did you say his name was again? And then, of course, it's like, all hail Galvatron.
Oh, just this. It's so wonderfully bittersweet. And it's like Starscream got his 5 minutes in the end.
I mean, not even that, really. He gets about 30 seconds. I mean, he probably gets about 10 seconds of being Decepticon leader. He's literally just finished his like little coronation, trumpet fanfare. And then within seconds, he's blasted into the ether to become a ghost, as it turns out.
So after this scene, almost immediately afterwards, Unicron arrives in Cybertron's vicinity and devours at least 2 moons, both of them being Autobot moon bases, and those moons are just totaled. You get some incredible animation of people trying to escape and failing. We're just seeing more Autobots being eaten, quite frankly. Like, just no more. And I'm just thinking, flippin' heck, man. Like, how many casualties are there gonna be in this? And such. But now, under coercion by Unicron, Galvatron finally heads to Earth to kill Ultra Magnus. So we've just seen these 2 Autobot moon bases be destroyed. Ultra Magnus and co have been notified, but now the Decepticons arrive and we've got another freaking battle on our hands.
Yeah, and not only that, like as a kid, we're still reeling from the fact that we've just heard a swear word in Transformers.
Yep. The immortal line of, oh shit, what are we gonna do now?
Yeah, which I mean, again, like that's a really good bit of like classic sort of film scene of like you think like, oh, they've defeated him because they rig up the moon base with explosives. You see the big explosion. And it's like, yeah, like you can't survive that, and then it just like the smoke clears and it's just like there's not even a scratch, and then it's like, yeah, by Spike, by Bumblebee, off you go into Unicron's belly, but with the immortal, oh shit, what are we gonna do now? Is the line, and it's like, oh, I hope my mum didn't hear him say that.
So, in this scene that we get this battle on Earth before they're able to escape and such, worth noting, because I think it's one of the funniest bits of the entire film, Blur trying to forcibly lead the Dinobots onto the ship is so damn funny.
Yeah, it's a really good, it's some peak Dinobot, and it's also another really good sort of little Blur introductory moment. He doesn't really get a lot of time in this film. Like I always forget that, because in terms of the toys, obviously you had Ultra Magnus as the new leader, but then you had like Hot Rod, Cup and Blur all sort of got equal billing as like buy these toys, but it's all Hot Rod and Cup. Like Blur doesn't really do a whole lot in this film. This is probably like the most interesting thing that he gets to do. But yeah, the Dinobot stuff is all really good there because it's just some peak like obstinate Dinobots. Also really enjoy Galvatron as like annoyed Sunday driver in this scene because he's flying around trying to get shots off at the various Autobots. Whenever they shoot back, he just gives them that like fist clenched through the windscreen of like, you've just damaged my Cyclonus, how dare you. Like,
I think one of the sweeps just explodes as well, I think.
Yeah, there's some stuff going on there, but like there's a couple of times where like the Cyclonus that he's or you know, his armada that he's like flying in just kind of, you know, gets a stray blast, and just both times he's just like shaking fists through the window of just like, what are you doing?
I need to point out the line from Grimlock. I think when he's been called like a nice dino by Blur, and he just says, "Me Grimlock, not nice dino. Me bash brains." It's a great line. Also, this is a weird question to ask Andy, but I feel it needs to be asked now, so I refer to him in the right way forevermore. When the Decepticons arrive at Autobot City, Galvatron says, "I, Galvatron, will crush you just as Megatron crushed Prime." At this point because the way I kind of always thought and imagined it is, it's still Megatron, but he's now just Galvatron. Are they now actually two completely different Transformers, just having been reformatted? Or like, is the consciousness still the same, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't...
Is it like they've just swapped an SD card into another thing, or...?
yeah, that's how Transformers work. It's all on SD cards.
By 2005, maybe?
Yeah, well, exactly. I can't remember... Again, this might be a really interesting question to keep in mind as we go through Season 3, because I don't know if it does any stuff with Galvatron. Because, again, the comics very much played with the idea of what has happened to Galvatron, or really what has happened to Megatron as part of Galvatron, and basically it comes to the conclusion like Galvatron kind of loses his mind because of the weird stuff that's happened to him, because, you know, he is still Megatron but he's also not, and he kind of goes, you know, he kind of goes off the reservation. I don't know whether the cartoon ever really kind of deals with that at all, and the sort of the mental anguish of what has become of him, but the comics certainly picked up on that as an idea of like, isn't it weird that you're not really Megatron anymore, but you also kind of are, because you have these shared memories and experiences, but like, how does that all work? Especially once time travel becomes involved and you get Megatron versus Galvatron, and then it's like, wait, if you kill yourself but it's not yourself, does that... It's a whole thing. Read the comics. But yeah, like that's... I don't think this ever gets tackled in the cartoon, but I may be wrong. I'll be interested in Season 3 for that.
Okay, I'm glad I made a good observation on that then, in hindsight. So the Autobots are able to escape from this onslaught they've got. Eventually, Galvatron manages to cause one shuttle to crash on yet another metal planet, which it's written down here, Andy, as Quintessa. I'm not sure if that's actually ever name-checked in the film, but that's what the recap here on the TF Wiki says. Yeah,
I mean, it certainly becomes name-checked in Season 3. But yeah, I guess, yeah, because the Quintessons are sort of, you know, the natives of the planet. So yeah, I guess Quintesson, I think, is also the planet, if I recall.
And detonates the other with a volley of missiles. However, the Autobots in that other ship I just mentioned, they actually kind of did like a whole like cool separation moment of like the front of the ship and stuff, so they actually escape unnoticed. But now the Autobots in the crashed shuttle have Hot Rod, Cup, the Dinobots. They are all separated from each other and are in a hostile environment, to say the least. Hot Rod and Cup are captured by a squad of Alicons, who I think look really freaking cool, Andy, and I want one. Just saying. And they are taken before a Quintesson judge. Now, just to put this out there, just for continuity's sake for the podcast and more, the Quintesson is not actually name-checked at all. It's just a thing. In the credits, it's called a Quintesson. At the ending credits, it's not actually referred to as a Quintesson, though. Worth noting. While being held there, they learn the name and nature of Unicron from Kranix, apparently is the name of his character, I didn't know, didn't name check it, a survivor of the planet destroyed in the opening sequence of the film, which he calls Lithone, or Lithone, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, sorry. Meanwhile, the Dinobots encounter and befriend a young, wild Autobot we come to find out is named Wheelie, who has been living alone on Quintessa. Together, they crash the trial just as Hot Rod and Cup are fighting losing odds against the Quintessons' Sharkticons. The tide is turned and the Autobots commandeer a really odd-looking Quintesson cruiser.
A pretty cool looking ship as well. Like the ship designs in this film are really good. Like the ship that Unicron gives like Galvatron's pretty nifty. Like they're all way more interesting than the Ark. Like there's Quintesson one, and that sort of carries through to the end of the film. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in these kind of like various off-planet scenes. I mean, again, I really enjoy the whole like space battle before these crash landings. I am a big fan of any film or series where somebody reverses the polarities of something. So when they reverse the polarity of the Decepticon missiles, I'm here for that.
But actually, just to touch on that, because Cup is like the MVP of this part of the film, because him recounting like war stories and the Dinobots freaking loving it is like some of my favourite parts of this film. It's like, please tell Grimlock more stories.
Yeah, it's great because like they're trying to literally take off to kind of like escape, their incoming death, and Cup's literally like, Grimlock, get your noodle out of my face. Like he's literally trying to like start the engines on this cruiser.
And the reason I mention that as well is because it's Cup trying to remember, how did we get out of that problem in that past battle? And the whole war story thing is just such a fun element.
Yeah, there's also really good like throwaway comedy lines. Like, I'm trying to remember how we got out of that battle. There are a lot of fatalities that day. And it's just like, all right, okay. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember we reversed polarities. And then on the other ship, you have some great like Perceptor rambling, and you get to the Ultra Magnus just like head in his chin, just like tapping his cheek, just like, okay. And then Perceptor is like, I'm just saying, yeah, I can fix that. But also the great line of like, I think it's Springer, or maybe it's RC, who's just like, it's a shame we had to let them detonate 3/4 of the ship. I think it's maybe Springer who comes back with like, well, they would have detonated 4/4 of it otherwise, which is again, Springer has some really good lines in this. But all of that sequence is really good and very cool. And then all the stuff on Quintesson, like that's a really interesting moment in terms of how that clearly resonated with a lot of people, because Quintesson becomes a really key part of like the cartoon in season 3, if I remember, and also like the comics. The Quintessons become a big deal. The Sharkticons kind of keep coming back because they're sharks, they're kind of cool, and so all of that stuff sort of really clearly like stuck in people's heads. Wheelie less so. Like Wheelie is the Ewoks of this film, in that like nobody asked for this and nobody's really interested. That was probably their biggest like new toy misstep of like, everyone's gonna love this little cheeky robot. Is gonna be just like the kids are gonna, this is like the kids' Cypher character, and everyone's just like, no, Wheelie's annoying, like he can go away.
I really like his banter with Grimlock though. Like it works with those two, I think.
Yeah, there's some good little sort of like rhyming couplets and stuff. But my favourite part of all of this is when the Dinobots like knock down the door to like the Quintesson like palace jail, call it what you will, and I think it's like Slag, or Slug as we call him now, is just like underneath the like the Quintesson sort of like bodyguard that's been crushed by the door, just leans down, just like, excuse me. It's just like fantastic. It's wonderful.
I will say as well, like the whole like Quintesson judge like concept, again, this is another really harrowing moment, because you hear guilty or innocent, you hear the word innocent, and he's dropped into a pool of Sharkticons. It's just like, the heck?
Yeah, and that whole thing, and again, I think that's the part that resonates with people, is that the whole 5-faced robot thing is just like, it's a really cool visual, and just the idea that there's this really warped planet with this, like it's basically kind of Wild West, and again, like, I mean, you probably get like the best Hot Rod line in the film as well, where it's just like, they're trying to see if they can transform before they get launched into the Sharkticon tank, and it's like, silence or you'll be held in contempt of this court, and Hot Rod's just like, I have nothing but contempt for this court.
That's a great line.
Like, you were practicing that one in the jail cell before you came out here, Hot Rod, because that's a good one.
So from there, the other group of Autobots have landed on the planet Junkion to make repairs, but are attacked again by Galvatron, who was tipped off to their survival by Unicron. During the battle, Ultra Magnus tries to open the Matrix to use its power, but is unable to do so, and instead is killed.
Blown to smithereens.
Yeah, like, arguably, Andy, I would say is deader than Prime at this point.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of like on the Starscream to Prime scale. He's kind of in the middle. Like, he hasn't been completely turned to dust like Starscream, but yeah, he's not just like, grayed out. And again, it really lingers on that. Like, it's not like he gets shot and he explodes. Like, he gets shot a bunch and he has this long kind of like guttural groan of like, oh, and then just bang, and it's just bits of Ultra Magnus everywhere, and it's like on top of everything that's, this is almost a smart play by the film, because we're ready for death at this point, and so you're just like, okay, that's it, Magnus is done as well, all right, that's weird, like, you were just trying to sell me the toy like in the comic 2 weeks ago and you've already offed him. I didn't like him anyway, so it's fine, but but it's like, well, this was fast, and yeah, like, it feels really and again, it feels like the real darkest moments of the film, because not only is Prime gone, it's like, okay, but they've still got the Matrix, and we've had the whole light our darkest hour thing, so this is they can still turn this around, and then the Matrix doesn't open, the person it's been entrusted with has just been destroyed, Galvatron's gone off to Unicron, and it's like, what do you do? Like, there's no way back from this. And I like, that's sort of, I remember as a kid that being the moment of like, given everything that had happened, you're like, is there going to be a happy ending to this film? Like, is this film going to end with just like, and then the Transformers were obliterated and it was all over and Unicron ruled the universe by the Unicron toy, because it's literally the only Transformer now. Like, is this where this is going? Because it feels like it. And again, I've sort of talked about this before, about how like good media can make you believe something that probably isn't going to happen, because you've got to have a happy ending, or something of a positive ending at the end of this, but you're brought to this moment where you're just like, there's no way back, like, this is done, like, it's finished. And those are really good moments in the film.
I want to, when we sort of get to the end of the film, I want to come back to a point you mentioned about sort of having been introduced to the comics, because I have a question which kind of also helps set my entire perspective of the film, so I'll come back to that. Remind me if I forget, by the way. So Galvatron absconds with the Matrix, taking it away to Unicron. The remaining Autobots at this point, Perceptor, Blur, Springer, RC, and Spike's son Daniel, are then ambushed by Junkions, aka many Eric Idols. The eponymous natives of Junkion, who are giant transforming robots. The battle is cut short, however, by the arrival of Hot Rod's group in their Quintesson ship. After exchanging the universal greeting, which, Andy, because you can recite it better than I can, is...
Bar weep grana weep ninny-bong.
There you go. They're all friends, and the Junkions restore Ultra Magnus to life. It's like, oh, he's back, sure. And then together the whole group then travels to Cybertron to try to recover the Matrix and destroy Unicron. That's a very condensed way of summing up this scene, because a lot happens, quite frankly. Like, Wreck-Gar, the leader of the Junkions, and just the Junkions as a concept, is so weirdly fun and unique. The fact their entire dialogue is based off TV is great.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those, like, they could not have found anybody better than Eric Idle to like pull off that character. I mean, again, I can't remember what kind of. I think I seem to recall there's a pretty good Wreck-Gar in like the season 3 that they sort of they managed to keep that going. But like Eric Idle really knocks it out the park there. Dare to Be Stupid. Like, I knew nothing about Weird Al Yankovic before this film, and it was just like, oh my god, this song is so great and so fun, and like I know all the lyrics, and yeah, it's a fun little action scene. Daniel gets to brain a Junkion around the head with a 2x4, which is a pretty good ending to that scene, just with a big clunk, which is very satisfying. And then this is probably the most rushed bit of the film, where you go from that utter darkness of like, oh my god, like everything's gone bad, to like weird, like now we're just having a dance with the Junkions. And yay.
I agree. Like in a weird way, like the first thing I thought of was, is this straight out of Star Wars? Because I'm sure this happens in there at some point. But yeah, this is, as is kind of par for the course of Transformers at this point, Andy. This is the part where they kind of realised we need to end this film at the 90-minute mark. But we also have like a 5-minute long credit sequence as well to fit in. So you can kind of tell from the way this film picks up at this point that they were clearly a bit rushed for time. The other story thing, which I honestly don't know if this is touched on in season 3, because I've only ever seen bits of it and I just don't know. But what's the way to put this? If the Junkions can rebuild Ultra Magnus without issue, could they not have rebuilt Optimus Prime?
I mean,
I appreciate the hierarchy of Hasbro didn't want that, but inherently in the story...
Yeah, I mean that's where you can feel the really weird like way that they have to like work around that with the way that Ultra Magnus gets blown up. Because again, you think what Galvatron did to Starscream, like, you know, they clearly didn't want a half hour of just like little tiny jigsaw pieces of Ultra Magnus of like putting them back together. They're like, no, he's got to blow apart cleanly. And to be fair, there's something very satisfying about watching the Junkions put Ultra Magnus back together and just polish him up. It's like those videos they put online to sell you on like, you know, cleaning products, and they show you and it's really filthy, and then they do just a thing and they do it all really quick, and then suddenly it's gleaming and shining. You can just watch it on a loop over and over again, and it's great. Like that's kind of what watching Ultra Magnus get rebuilt is like, because it's just like, oh, that feels good. I like watching him just getting slotted back together and polished up. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. But
also,
yeah,
the way the Junkions interact with each other is really cool as well.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I really like about that whole fight scene is like, you know, because they all transform into bikes, so they're like bike and rider, and you knock the rider off the bike, and then they'll just swap. They'll both just do a transform and do it, and it's like, I mean, Springer says it's like, you know, knocking them down is easy, it's keeping them down that's the trick. And that's kind of, it works really well as the whole idea of like, you know, this planet of junk, they're kind of just like very sort of versatile and just kind of roll with it. But it really adds something to that scene. But yeah, the Junkions are cool. And yeah, like it's kind of nice that they're not just a throwaway. They kind of like join in the final battle as well, because, you know, they continue to be valuable through to sort of towards the end of the film, which is kind of nice. Like unlike Wheelie, like is Wheelie even still around? Like at the climax of that film, he just kind of disappears.
Yes, he is, because I've got a note about it.
Okay, that's good.
Also in this scene, Grimlock's reaction to being kissed is quite amusing.
yeah, some more good Grimlock time.
Also, important note, because I don't know why, I'm half tempted to try and keep this in mind for season 3, Andy. Based on Retgar's dialogue, which I appreciate is just him reciting an advert, Ultra Magnus has a 90-day warranty.
Yeah. I mean, that's not very long, really. I mean, you'd be hoping for a year at least. I mean, especially, you know, having been blown apart so easily. But hey.
So at this point, Galvatron has now gone back to Unicron and is kind of just trying to boss his way around, I think it's fair to say. Like, haha, I've got the Matrix. You can't do anything now. He tries to open the Matrix to use his power against Unicron and force his master into submission, but is unable to open it. Unicron, not pleased with this attempt at treachery, shocks Galvatron by transforming from a planet into a planet-sized robot. This transformation sequence, Andy, is immense. It's so good.
Yeah. Again, I mean, this was like kid me not realizing that I was watching anime and being like, oh my god, like look at this transformation. And now I've watched a bunch of anime. It's just like, yep, that's how that goes. That's how the robots transform in Japan. This happens all the time. But it is really cool. And again, the little subtle touches in this film that I like is like watching Galvatron try to like pry open the Matrix. Like, you know, he tries to open it from the handles the sensible way. That doesn't work, and you seemed like trying to kind of get underneath it and just like pry it open. There's some really good Foley work of this like scratchy kind of metal on like diamond kind of feeling of just like, can I just prise this open with like brute force, which is just really pleasing. And then yeah, like, you know, Unicron's transformation is just like this, oh my god, because that's, I mean, I know, I guess some of the key visuals for this film did show like Unicron in his robot mode. I'm trying to remember if I'd seen any of those before I saw the film, because I feel like I remember this being like, oh, you kind of know he's a transformer, he's going to transform, but I'm not sure I was quite expecting like what you get there. And again, yeah, just like this really meticulous kind of transformation sequence that is really kind of cool, like the blow by blow of like, you know, his chest kind of plates rolling back and he's seeing all this like energy inside his belly, and then soon to be Galvatron inside his belly as well.
You've just literally gone straight to my next thought, Andy, because as the TF Wiki puts it, Unicron plucks Galvatron off his chest and swallows him. Yeah. Very succinct. Matrix and all, and then begins attacking Cybertron itself. At this point, we see Shockwave for the first time in a hot minute, and he scrambles the Decepticon forces to defend the planet, but they are ineffective against such a large enemy.
Yeah, and again, that's such a cool little moment where you just see like Unicron just smash his hand down on the planet, and it's again just the scale of it at that point where you just realize like, oh man, this is like, this guy is huge. And then yeah, poor Shockwave only ever gets any like screen time when bad things are happening on Cybertron, but boy,
you're not wrong actually, now you mention it.
Yeah, like it's usually just somebody like, finally nobody's broken into his lab in like a decade, but now somebody's just smashing up the entire planet instead.
Also worth noting at this point, I think as well, we don't actually know Shockwave's fate in this film, do we?
No, we don't see any more of him once he scrambles the Decepticons.
Or once he's flattened, take your pick. So shortly after all of this, the Autobots arrive from Junkion, and, you know, they could try and land on Cybertron, they could probably try and scramble to try and do something. Instead, Andy, they arguably do the really smart thing with the Quintesson ship, fly it straight through Unicron's eye.
Yeah, if you've got a drill spaceship, you might as well just drill through something, and why not? I mean, it is effective. Like, it's probably the most damage anybody does in like the early salvos of that battle. So like, yeah, kudos to them. I mean, doesn't end well for the ship ultimately, admittedly, but you know, it's a good ploy.
The impact destroys the ship, and the Autobots fall out inside Unicron. Hot Rod, though, is separated from the others, but eventually runs into Galvatron, and we get the fight between the two. Hot Rod manages to get his hands on the Matrix, and hears Optimus Prime's voice speak the words, "Arise, Rodimus Prime," as the battle is reaching its climax. Hot Rod grows in stature, adopts a much sterner demeanour, and quickly dispatches Galvatron by tossing him through Unicron's hull. He just picks him up and throws him. This dude is strong, Andy. And then Galvatron just goes flying into space, because I guess we've established at this point Galvatron probably can't fly because he's been in the ship the whole time.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, when he's first transformed, when he goes to his ship, he uses his cannon as like propulsion. So I would argue that he can fly. Maybe he just doesn't want to. Maybe he's just done with today.
Oh, Lord Unicron, no!
Yeah, I'll just go wherever space takes me, and I will return for season 3 with a different voice actor.
Regarding that battle, actually, and then I'll finish that thought. I really, really enjoy this battle between the two, because there's another moment of just kind of that sort of character development I mentioned with Megatron, and obviously now Galvatron at this point. But there's this point where he's trying to talk Hot Rod into being like, look, we've got a common enemy here. We need to take down Unicron. This Matrix can do him in. And then Unicron just like mentally overpowers Galvatron and makes him start fighting Hot Rod, excuse me. And it's just that moment again of, damn man, like how the mighty have fallen. Even in your reformatted form, you still can't do it well, can you?
Yeah. I mean, you'd have thought even in that moment he might have had enough time to like toss the Matrix to Hot Rod and be like, maybe you can do something with this. But that would have been a far less interesting final set piece, because like again it gets to a really good like up close and personal kind of like bit of hand to hand between them, where it's like Galvatron's like first Prime then Magnus, like it's a pity you Autobots die so easily, or I might get a sense of satisfaction, or whatever the line is. And Hot Rod like some solid tactics where he just like basically like transforms and just blinds him with his headlights, and it's like, okay, that worked, I guess.
So at this point, Rodimus Prime at this point opens the Matrix, which fills Unicron with light and begins destroying him. While all this has been going on, the other Autobots inside Unicron have located some of their comrades from the moon bases who had been presumed dead, including Bumblebee and Daniel's father, Spike. I mean, I say the other Autobots have. Daniel finds them, quite frankly, because they got separated like a flood of Unicron fluid, I guess. I don't know what it's meant to be, but sure. We'll just say that. It's a wonderful moment where he sees them effectively being, like, they're all being, like, what's the way to put it? They're, like, being hung from almost like coat hangers on a conveyor belt, in a way. And they're being dropped into a vat of Unicron goo, I guess, to get melted down.
Yeah, and again, like really kind of shocking scene there where you get like a close up within the vat of acid and see like these dissolving robots just like fading away, and it's like, man, this is really bleak as well. And then and then after seeing that, you're just like, oh man, a bunch of my favorite toys are next on this conveyor belt. Only Daniel can save them. Oh no.
It's a wonderful moment as well when, like, because Daniel is also, we haven't actually brought this up, Andy, but like the whole concept of like the exosuit that both Spike and Daniel are wearing, it's a really cool concept for like a design. The fact they can like transform themselves, it's really, really good fun.
Yeah, and it actually gets a little bit of use. Like, Daniel gets to transform. I have questions about how no limbs are broken in that process, but I'll take it. And there's a really nice little kind of training scene where Daniel figures out how to use that, which is kind of quite nice. And like again, clearly one of those like writers' problems that probably occurred at some point is like, we want the humans in space, and it's like, how do we put the humans in space? Like, in a way that is in any way useful. And like they came up with, a pretty cool like design and the whole exosuit thing, which works really well and is used right the way through to this climactic little bit of the film.
Which involves Spike, who's hanging on the conveyor belt, effectively going, Daniel, you gotta close the vat! Like, shut the lid! And he's like, how do I do that? Use the rocket blaster gun thing on your thing. I have one of those. Yes! Hurry!
Yeah, I feel like his impatience is not really helping there, where he could have just calmly like, press that button and it'll fire the lasers, but instead he just like, do something. And after firing off a couple of the wrong things, he basically lucks out and closes the cover to the vat just in time, which again, really well like framed shot, because you get to see like Spike dropping, you kind of see like Daniel looking away and just like scrunching his eyes like, I'm not gonna look, and you have that, oh, did he do it or did he not? And again, knowing this film, would not have been surprised, like, no, sorry son, your dad just dropped in a vat of acid, you failed. But no, Spike is okay, as it turns out.
At this point, the Autobots, including Rodimus and co, because they've all managed to find each other now, escape through Unicron's remaining eye as he begins to fall apart and explode. This is also when it becomes apparent, Andy, that some of the OG G1 Transformers are still alive at this point, which in itself, I'll go through the list in a minute of who has actually made it out alive. But you're like, oh, okay, so not all of you have been written out forever then. Fair play. So Unicron explodes. The scene immediately then shifts to the surface of Cybertron, where, for unclear reasons, as it's noted on the TF Wiki, the Autobots seem to be in charge again. Which is a fair point, actually, now you mention it. Rodimus Prime then comes out to give a speech, which is the following. Let this mark the end of the Cybertronian wars as we march forward to a new age of peace and happiness, till all are one. And everyone repeats it, and we zoom out at that point. And And the lineup that we see them panning across on the screen, Andy, of the Autobots that we see, including humans, are as follows. Rodimus Prime, Grimlock, Wheelie, Blur, Daniel and Spike, RC, Bumblebee, Jazz, excellent, Ultra Magnus, Cup, Perceptor, Sludge, Slag, Cliffjumper of all people, and Wreck-Gar. How did Cliffjumper survive this, Andy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was there on that conveyor belt. Yeah, it's like him, Bumblebee, and Jazz, like as the sort of the moon base, spokesman. That's not the word I was looking for, but it'll do. Like, but because it's like Bumblebee was always. If there's one Transformer that you'd save from G1 continuity for popularity reasons, it would be Bumblebee. If there's two, it would probably be Bumblebee and Jazz. If there were three, Cliffjumper would not be number 3. Like, I swear there's somebody, Cliffjumper had some dirt on somebody, or Cliffjumper's voice actor had some dirt on the writers, I think. It was like, you better not take me out of this show, or, those photos will end up somewhere.
I want a deleted scene of Cliffjumper trying to take on Unicron because he didn't think fast enough.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? Also, by the way, in that final scene with Unicron, we didn't mention perhaps the greatest thing that happens in this film, which is Grimlock's declaration of "Me, Grimlock, kick butts," and then he actually goes and kicks Unicron's butt, which is it's just so brilliant. It's so good. Brilliant. And I mean, that whole
still only 4 Dinobots though. Just saying.
Yeah, that is weird. Like, I feel like I've never actually noticed that, which is doubly strange. But yeah, like that whole kind of like Dinobots kind of laying into Unicron bit is good. Then Grimlock like me Grimlock need new strategy when Unicron's just like clutching at his buttocks and just like, oh, what's going on there? I don't like this. Which and the final thing I'll say about those kind of closing scenes is also, like, the agony that Unicron is in once the Matrix has been unleashed. Like, he rips off his own leg because it's so agonizing for him. Like, that's another kind of overlooked dark moment in this film of just like he rips off his own limb before he explodes because he's in so much pain. And just that really good final line of like, it's my destiny, and then he just like explodes. Is also very good.
And that, everyone, is Transformers the movie. So, Andy, the thing I was kind of alluding to earlier, in terms of, like, characters being introduced and such and whatnot. So you mentioned that... Did you say that Ultra Magnus was introduced in the comic before the film came out?
Not... The thing is that it was less about that than being in like the comic continuity, and it's more that there was, especially because, again, for the UK audience, this film came out in December, not in the summer. So the problem that they had was they had to push all the new toys for Christmas sales before people had seen them in the film, basically. So I knew who Ultra Magnus and Galvatron was, not from the comic itself, but from the incessant adverts that were placed within said comic of just like, it's the new leaders, it's Galvatron and Ultra Magnus, aren't they cool? And like, look, his Hot Rod and Cup and Blur, and his like Scourge and Cyclonus. So it was all the advertising that was having to, be around characters that I hadn't seen in the film yet, because obviously your Christmas promo sort of ramps up in like November time. So I was sort of aware of these characters because I'd already seen the toys, which is probably different to how people in the US experienced it, where I suspect it was probably the other way around. As you'd go to the cinema, you'd see these characters and be like, oh man, I wonder if there'll be toys of those, and then probably like September, October, you'd start seeing the adverts for the toys.
It's also interesting that you just said that they really do just push Ultra Magnus as the new leader as well.
That was literally the promo line was, it's the new leaders, Ultra Magnus and Galvatron. And Rodimus Prime kind of came later. I feel like Rodimus Prime never really got much of a push in the UK. Like, they pushed the Hot Rod toy a lot. There's an amazing stock photo around from, I think it's like a Toys R Us in Dundee, where they had like a life-size Hot Rod outfit that a guy wore to like promote Transformers, like in Dundee of all places. It's really weird. But yeah, I don't remember Rodimus Prime. I guess he probably was like kicking around in the UK, and there was promotion for him. But Ultra Magnus and Galvatron was their big push. Like they clearly had Ultra Magnus pegged as like the new Optimus Prime in terms of toy sales, even if he wasn't really represented that way in the film eventually.
The reason I mention it is because, and I think I alluded to this earlier in the podcast, that for me, I never really appreciated the impact this film had on all of the Transformers G1 continuity until now, quite frankly, with us having gone from the start of G1 to where we are now on the podcast lineage and stuff. And I was always under the impression, based on having seen the movie in the past, but never having seen the full series for whatever reason, that the likes of Magnus, Hot Rod, RC, and Springer were introduced before the movie. Which is why they just kind of are already there, and there's never any proper introductions to them, as it were. Or it doesn't feel like there is. I mean, we've hardly mentioned RC, to be quite frank, but RC in this film is amazing. Just such a fun character, a really cool character. But it is just fascinating how, in hindsight now, this film is such a culture shock, the way that it's all gone about, and just how they've just introduced these brand new characters. And, like I said earlier, Hot Rod's effectively the reason that Prime's died, yet you've made him the new leader, ultimately.
Yeah. There's a lot of kind of interesting stuff in there because you'd have thought you'd have more origin stories, and again the Ultra Magnus stuff is the part that really blows my mind because, like I said, given that promotion, you'd have thought that you'd make him up front and center as like a strong, almost as good as Optimus Prime. Like, even if you do what you do with Hot Rod, like you want to make Ultra Magnus seem like this amazing, strong robot man, but he's really not in this film. Like, he doesn't do a lot, then he gets blown up, then he gets kind of sad about it, and then kind of everyone else takes over, and that's his lot. So it's kind of weird. And again, I mean, I think Springer is a weird one because I'm pretty sure he was available pre-movie because he was a triple changer. Like, he came out around about the same time as like Blitzwing and Astro Train, and they sort of I could be misremembering that, but he was definitely he is a triple changer
because we saw him be a helicopter, didn't we? What's his other?
Yeah, he's a helicopter and a kind of like it's a car, but it's a kind of like I think I forget what the specific kind of like ability it is, but I think he's supposed to be like a sort of almost Dune buggy but not kind of thing. But like he's a triple changer as well, which again you think you don't really get much. He doesn't get sold that much in that film, and again Blur, as I said, doesn't get a whole lot. He gets a few lines and gets to buzz about a bit, but they don't, for a pretty cool looking robot toy, like they don't actually sell you on him particularly.
Interesting. But in terms of watching this film for the first time in a long time, like I've said, and the fact it was in 4K HDR as well for me, this was such an experience, Andy. Seeing the film in this immaculate amount of detail, it was just quite frankly, it was just a mind-blowing experience. I could try and make so many superlatives about it, but I had such an amazing time watching this. And I actually do think us having done the podcast to where we've got to so far, where we've watched Series 1 and all of Series 2, and we've kind of read so many trivia bits as we've gone along, as we started introducing that as a thing to discuss as well. It's just all added up and built to this almost perfectly, and it was such a fun, harrowing, confusing, all emotion, just an all-inspiring, all-encompassing experience, quite frankly.
Yeah, and it's certainly been interesting for me, kind of watching it off the back of the cartoon, like I said, because it's always as a kid, it was very much I saw all of season 1, bits and bobs of season 2, and so the film was kind of almost sat alone as its own entity for me, always in my head. So watching it and kind of having a bit more connective tissue is kind of interesting in a lot of ways. But like having endured quite a few years of sort of like ropey transfers of this on DVD and what have you. Like the place that it's at now, where like even in terms of like its audio quality, because you know I'm that guy with a 5.1 surround system. Like the audio mastering is really spot on for this edition as well, and you know it's probably. I mean, it's undoubtedly probably better than what I actually watched as the cinema as a kid. But it sort of feels like, you know, it's reliving that experience of, you know, now we have big TVs at home and stuff, and you know the fidelity of it. You really get the scale of it, and it is crazy when you look at it compared to your average episode of the cartoon. Like, you know, even like the Girly Love Power Glide, which I've sort of name checked as like best looking episode of Transformers, it's a really good looking episode, but it still doesn't hold a candle to this, because it's just, you know, it's so off the chain. And I'm so glad it exists, because I think I would still have loved Transformers just as much without it, but this is such a centerpiece and a focal point of that love that I can, you know, as you've noticed, I've just been sat here like rolling off quotes off the top of my head for the last 2 hours, because I have seen this film enough times that, you know, I remember every line and every beat. And it's, you know, it's weird because I never get bored of watching this film. There's something about it that just always hits the spot. Like, you know, there are things that you can love and eventually you're just like, I've seen this so many times now, it just rolls off of me. But I never sit and put this film on and just have it in the background. Like when I watch it, I watch it, and you know, I always like marvel at the animation. I always love the dialogue, all the little things about it. Every single time they always just hit, and it's just like, yeah, this is, you know, I realize that this is not like the greatest film ever made, but maybe it's like the second best. No, I mean, it's, you know, it's a very good film for me for like a kid's cartoon. And again, it's been the nice thing about the recent like 30th and 35th anniversary releases to see people going from, oh, it's a dumb movie to sell toys, to like, sure, it was a movie to sell toys, but actually it does a lot of pretty cool stuff that was really brave for its time. And you know, you could argue back and forth how effective it was as a marketing tool, etc., etc. You know, whether it actually killed like the Transformers toy line long term or whatever. But as a film, as a piece of media that I want to watch, I think it's great.
Well, it's funny you mention it, Andy, because you could also say that like Weird Al Yankovic's song being called "Dare to Be Stupid" is almost an encapsulation of this film in some ways. So I think that is almost the perfect segue to discuss what happened after this movie was released. So the film had a budget of $6 million US, which, for a random reference, Andy, I found a note that said this is 6 times more than the equivalent cost of 90 minutes of the TV series.
Yeah, that would scan.
It didn't make its budget back.
No, and I think that's where movies like this get particularly hard to evaluate, because, you know, this is that money is not just about box office, it's also about marketing spend effectively on the toys. And you know, how do you evaluate that? Because, you know, I can tell you like where my 50 quid went off of the back of this on toys. Like, you know, how much impact did it have? But yeah, certainly it was, I mean, interestingly, like if you look at it as well, 1986 was a really bad year to try and break into the box office, because there were a lot of massive films came out that year, so it was a very crowded market.
Definitely. Worth noting as well that it made $1.8 million in its opening weekend in August, in the US, I should say, in 1986, and in total managed to scrape together just shy of $6 million. So it wasn't far off of its budget ultimately, but obviously, you know, you kind of want to make the budget back quickly, to say the least, so you can then make profit, as it were.
Yeah, and of course, given that this is, you know, the Hollywood film system, there's probably some creative accounting there where people probably made more money than they'll actually let on. But that's every film.
That said, in the US, when the film was released in 1987 on home video, minus Spike saying the word shit to make it known. Because the video was rated as all ages, it was a top 25 chart performer in sales for 40 consecutive weeks. Yeah. The film itself was rated PG, which in the US apparently, Andy, and I found this an interesting note, was done intentionally because apparently films that have a PG rating as opposed to what we have in the UK of U, or whatever all ages is in America, apparently PG rated films get more screenings at US cinemas than all ages do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. It's the typical thing of like it's the certificate becomes a weird like marketing sales point of just like, hey, this is going to be a little bit edgy. Maybe there's a swear word in it. Actually has a positive effect on the people watching it.
We've touched on Orson Welles a couple of times during this. He actually passed away about a month or so, or within the month or so, I should say, after he had completed work on the film. And there is a famous quote which he told his biographer, Barbara Leeming, about him having done the film. Quote, "You know what I did today? I played the voice of a toy. I play a planet. I menace somebody called something or other, then I'm destroyed. My plan to destroy whoever it is thwarted, and I tear myself apart on the screen." End quote.
Yeah, that's a very Orson Welles way of describing Transformers the movie.
Now, obviously, we've talked about what we thought of this, Andy. I think it is worth noting what critics thought of this film. So, here is some of the reception that we got, or I should say that the film got, when it came to the film. And these quotes are courtesy from the TF Wiki, I will mention once again. From Variety's film review, quote-unquote, "The Transformers, in which Orson Welles plays a planet, is pure headache material. Target audience of cartoon watchers will also probably find the film unintelligible, noisy, and unoriginal. Box office prospects are dismal," end quote. From Leonard Moulton, I think it's pronounced, pardon me, from 1987 Movie and Video Guide. Quote-unquote, "Obnoxious animated feature about the title good guys who defend the universe against an evil planet, which has a voice of its own, provided by Orson Welles. That deafening rock score certainly doesn't help. Little more than a feature-length toy commercial," end quote. I'll read this quote and I think we're going to notice a pattern here, Andy. From the New York Times. "While all this action may captivate young children, the animation is not spectacular enough to dazzle adults. And the Transformers have few truly human elements to lure parents along, even when their voices are supplied by well-known actors," end quote. I mean, that last quote in itself, I disagree with the animation stuff, but that's a debate potentially for another day. But just those three quotes in itself, it really does put across who watched the film from those publications, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the typical thing of, any sort of franchise film, even to this day, you can find reviews of franchise kind of, cartoons, like a Demon Slayer or a Dragon Ball Z or whatever, where critics will instantly be dismissive of it because of that very nature and because, like, well, this is just a marketing thing or whatever. And yeah, so some things haven't changed very much, as it turns out, and you can kind of get it. Like, I mean, if this was your first introduction to Transformers, it would be a kind of noisy mess, because if you don't know who Optimus Prime is, who cares that he's gone a bit grey and he's died. So yeah, I get it. Like, it's the typical thing with critics, where of course they haven't watched all of the episodes of Transformers or G.I. Joe or whatever, and it's never going to do well in reviews. And yeah, even the animation kind of point, again, probably comparing to like Disney stuff, which is spectacular in a very different way, and you'd maybe look and compare that to the Transformers movie, like it's a different kind of craft in a lot of ways. So yeah, not surprising to be honest.
Well, let me read you this quote, Andy, from the Toledo Blade. Quote, "Everything is I can't even say this without laughing. Quote unquote, "Everything is poorly drawn and, when it's in focus, one-dimensional. It is terribly hard to separate the robots from the backgrounds, and there is no easy way to tell the good guys from the bad guys. In an earlier movie based on the same sort of robot toys, GoBots, the Battle of the Rock Lords. The good guys were either white or colourful, and the bad guys were dreary, and they had distinct personalities. Not this movie. Everyone looks and sounds alike, except one pink robot who is a female good guy. Her tin voluptuousness makes her stand out. End quote.
I mean, if only they'd put insignias on all the robots so that you could tell them apart. Hey, I mean, it sounds like that guy went to a cinema with really bad projection,
right?
Like, oh, it's all really blurry and I couldn't see what was happening. It's like, well, I think you need to talk to the projectionist at your local cinema. Also, to compare something negatively to GoBot's Battle of the Rock Lords is perhaps the most obscene and offensive thing I've ever heard said against this film. Because I have watched GoBot's Battle of the Rock Lords, and I can tell you that is a terrible movie. I mean, the titular Rock Lords are literally just transforming rocks. Like, you could not think of a more boring. Anyway, yeah, GoBot's not very good.
So, other notes to just make note of, quite frankly, damage control. Now, obviously, there were a lot of upset children at this film. There's been reports of people having walked out. I think in one of the retrospective documentaries, Andy, it was mentioned that, like, a kid locked himself in his bathroom at home for 2 weeks because he was so upset about Optimus Prime's death and such. But over time, it has become quite the revered film. An additional interesting note is that the UK home video release would add a note at the end of the film saying Prime would return. Which brings me on to some interesting, I'll say differences in terms of the sequencing of the UK version of the release on... maybe this is actually in the cinema as well. You could probably tell me, Andy, or you might remember. Because there's additional VO added to the film on the UK release. Definitely on the home video, but do you recall if there was like an introductory sequence almost at the start of the film when you saw it in the cinema? Or did it say at the end Prime would return?
I think it did. There's definitely there's a Star Wars text crawl at the start,
okay.
Which is like, I mean, as if this film wasn't like Star Wars enough already, they decided to add a text crawl kind of explaining it. But yeah, I'm pretty sure. Again, I mean, very fuzzy memories, but I'm pretty sure the whole Optimus Prime will return was in the cinema version in the UK, but I could be misremembering.
So, because it's interesting, the reason I wanted to bring this up is because the Transformers Reconstructed Movie DVD, which I've actually got to the side here, which, fun note, Andy, as I pull this up to my side, I bought this from MVC, once again. According to the date of the receipt, I bought this on the 20th of October, 2005.
Well, the year 2005. Perfect.
Right? I just thought, you know what? That's a fun little anecdote there. Also, apparently it cost me $14.99 and my new points balance at this point was £48.79. Just saying.
Yeah, you should probably cash those in before MVC goes out of business.
So, the crawl at the beginning of the film, which is kind of an introduction, if you will, to perhaps people who don't know Transformers, is the following. And also noted as well, it's the same deep voice guy sort of doing the voiceover, so nice bit of continuity there. There's an evil new force in the universe, a monster planet that devours everything in its path, and it's heading for the small planet of Cybertron, where a unique race of transforming robots continue to fight in a civil war. A war between good and evil that raged for millions of years. The evil Decepticon Transformers, led by the maniacal Megatron, have sworn to crush their enemies, the Autobots. To this end, they have relentlessly pursued them across the galaxy, from planet Cybertron to planet Earth and back again. But the heroic Autobot Transformers and their courageous leader Optimus Prime are not easily defeated. And then it says the year is 2005 and continues. Yeah,
because that's over. Like, I mean, the thing that makes that work is obviously that is over like the Lion Transformers theme. And to be fair, you can read a shopping list over the Lion Transformers theme, and it'll sound really good and cool. So but I'm always here for any sentence that involves the phrase maniacal Megatron, because I will never get tired of hearing those words together.
And at the end of the film, after we get Rodimus's speech and the camera is panning back just before we see Unicron's head zooming across like the orbit of Cybertron, the voiceover, this following voiceover, appears. The battle is over, but the galaxy-spanning adventures of the Transformers will continue, and the greatest Autobot of them all, Optimus Prime, will return.
And he does, so they didn't lie. I feel like they should have gone all in on that and be like, Optimus Prime will return. So stop crying, kid. You don't want your mum to see you crying when the lights go up. So come on, man up. You gotta dry those eyes quick. You've got like 2 minutes for the end credits, and then you're gonna have to pretend you weren't crying. So get on it.
So another interesting note as well about the film in general is, now Andy, this is going to be a weird thing to ask you. Do you remember if when you saw the film it was in widescreen or 4:3?
Oh, this is the classic that will never go away in terms of whether it was widescreen or not. I cannot remember. I was not an expert on cinema format ratios when I was 6 years old. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it was widescreen because films were in widescreen in 1986. Exactly. So I realised people have very good sources that it was 4:3, but I remembered it being wide. But...
Yeah, because for those unaware, basically the long-standing lore behind this, if you will, is that the film was originally animated in 4:3, i.e. the regular size of a TV, for example, but to make it suitable for cinema screening, they effectively zoom cropped it, so it would appear as widescreen, thus losing some of the picture at the top and bottom of the screen. But in later releases on home video, this has kind of been rectified, quote unquote, so you get both versions. Like on the 4K release that I mentioned earlier, it's on the 4K disc it's the widescreen version, and then on the regular Blu-ray it's the full frame version. Having watched both versions, Andy, in preparation for this podcast, I'm gonna be honest, I think I prefer it in widescreen, because it feels more grandiose to me. It's the only way I can sum it up.
Yeah, I really should look up, especially now those versions are sort of readily available, to see, like, because I'm sure people will have done like shot by shot comparisons of what you're losing if it has indeed been zoom cropped. And to be fair, I mean, when you look at some of those shots that maybe haven't upscaled to 4 or been recaptured in 4K as well, maybe some of that is down to that, where they've had to like zoom in on the footage. But yeah, I mean, it's really hard to argue to anybody in 2022 to say no, you should watch this in 4:3. And I think I've always gone towards the widescreen version. And I think I have like watched the pan and scan at some point and not really seen a massive difference to it. But yeah, I should look it up, see whether there's some good like frame by frame comparisons to show what you're losing, if that is indeed the case.
And now, before we start to wrap up the podcast, some additional notes about the film from the TF Wiki. According to Buzz Dixon, who was a writer on G.I. Joe, Hasbro's decision to kill off Optimus Prime was actually an attempt to maintain some brand storytelling parity with G.I. Joe, as Dixon had just convinced them to allow the death of Duke in G.I. Joe the movie, as both films were in production at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those weird. I can never quite remember what the timeline was, because like G.I. Joe basically did exactly the same thing, but it just didn't hit quite as hard with people as Optimus Prime did, it seemed.
This film was the last professional performance by Orson Welles, who died only a month later. According to production materials shown at BotCon 2000 by Tim Finn, the voice recording sessions for The Transformers the movie were done on September 10 and 11 of 1985. Welles died on October the 10th of that same year. It's often been speculated that Unicron's last line, quote-unquote, "Destiny, you cannot destroy my destiny," was recorded by another actor, possibly Leonard Nimoy, because it sounds different than the other lines. The speculation has been quashed by statements by Transformers voice director Wally Burr. So there you go.
Yeah. That seemed to be the thing that finally got put to bed, because I remember that being an enduring kind of back and forth on whether Leonard Nimoy had recorded that line and perhaps even more of Orson Welles' line, but that does seem to have been shot down now. With
the exception of Starscream and possibly Shockwave, only the Autobots suffered fatalities in the movie. All of the other dead, quote-unquote, Decepticons from the Autobot City battle were rebuilt into Galvatron's new troops, and although more Decepticons were shown taking heavy damage and suffering huge casualties while fighting Unicron, their identities and their final condition are uncertain. Now, slight spoilers for Season 3 here, potentially. Just saying that, folks, if anyone wants to stay spoiler-free. But additionally, both Starscream and Unicron survived in the post-movie series in some form or another. Shockwave's death in the finished film is highly uncertain, although in the script, it is fairly strongly implied. He does make some miscoloured appearances in crowd shots in later cartoon episodes, but these are probably examples of the fairly common animation errors in those episodes.
Oh, poor Shockwave. What a way to go.
Somewhat ironically, and we talked about this earlier, Andy, though only 3 of the original 18 Autobots, Jazz, Cliffjumper and Bumblebee, are definitively shown to have survived in the movie, 2 would quite literally never be heard from again. Scatman Crothers passed away, though this doesn't stop Jazz from making any number of background cameos, and Casey Kasem quit the show early in the 3rd season. Which I'm guessing we'll get onto that when we get to that, Andy, but is that the event that you've been alluding to in past podcasts?
That is indeed.
Okay. The Dinobots spend the majority of the film in their dinosaur modes, a practice that would eventually carry into Season 3 of the cartoon. Swoop is the only one to spend extended minutes of time in robot mode due to the anatomical issues of walking in a flight-based mode. Fair. However, there are some instances where they are briefly shown in robot mode for a blink and you'll miss it moment for no reason whatsoever. Excuse me. Here's a fun one. Unicron's roars in the movie were stock vocalizations originally created for Marvel Productions' 1982 The Incredible Hulk animated series and performed by voice actor Bob Holt, who voiced the Hulk in that show.
You know, as soon as you started that sentence and you said Marvel, I was like, I bet that was the Incredible Hulk before. Because, yeah, like, as soon, you can't unhear it once you think about that. And it is a weird moment because, yeah, that roar is clearly, like, it's not Orson Welles doing it, that's for sure. And so, yeah, that makes sense that, of course, it's the Incredible Hulk.
Another interesting note on that, though, Holt otherwise never voiced a character in the Marvel Sunbow Transformers series, although he was a regular cast member on Challenge of the GoBots, funnily enough, as Coptor, but had also passed away the year before the film was released in 1986. So, Unicron has the distinction of featuring 2 posthumous performances for the same Transformers character in a single production.
Huh. It's a weird factoid.
So, Andy, final note then. You mentioned earlier that when this was shown on TV, it was broken up into, like, episode chunks. Seemingly, this was broken up into 5 parts, but designated as days, if you will. So it's like a 5-day story.
Okay. Now we know the time frame over which this all took place.
There you go, right?
Yeah. That's interesting because, given the runtime, yeah, I guess 5 episodes just about... Yeah,
if it's what, 20, if it's minus commercials, if it's what, I guess 18 minutes of footage?
Yeah, I guess it's once you factor in commercials, yeah, splitting it into 5 makes sense.
So there we go, and that wraps up, Andy, Transformers the movie. This is 100% our longest podcast we've done to date, but man, has it been good fun.
Yeah, and if you guys that have listened or watched through this, be thankful that we're not 24 hours in, because I could talk about this film forever, literally forever. I could, I could sit here and just like pause it on every scene and tell you what I liked about it and how good the dialogue was and blah blah blah. So it's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to rewatch the film, but it's a pleasure to actually have an excuse to talk about it and banter about it and mention all the things that are really great about it into the bargain. So it has been a good time.
But of course, now that we've watched that, Andy, there's only one place to go from here, and that is
GoBots.
Oh, God. Can you imagine?
Yeah, now we're going to start watching Challenge of the GoBots.
And that, everyone, will be on our next podcast when we will be discussing Season 3, Episodes 1 to 5. That being the 5-part storyline, The 5 Faces of Darkness. Now, admittedly, Andy, we haven't actually talked about this, but I think we were contemplating trying to actually go with the proper broadcast order for this season, weren't we? In the sense of like actually looking at the dates of when episodes aired, or were we going to stick to Hasbro Pulse's ordering?
I mean, we should probably just stick with Hasbro's ordering and hope that it's a little bit more sensible for season 3. Just so that, you know, it's easier for folks to follow, I guess. I seem to recall that it's maybe a bit more logical than season 2 was, but we will see. I'm excited to get into season 3 because I've watched very little of it. Like even compared to season 2, I think I've seen 5 Faces of Darkness, and there are maybe like a couple of other stories, a couple of other episodes that I've seen, but the vast majority of it kind of, you know, passed me over, and it's a big change for the cartoon. Obviously, like post-movie, you know, we've moved into the 2005 continuity. It's a completely different animation studio. It's no longer Toei, so there's a lot of change afoot, and I'm sort of keen to get into it. Good, bad, and so bad cast members quit to see what it's all about.
Yeah, do you know what? We hadn't actually touched on that the movie was Toei's swan song, and do you know what, mate? If that was their swan song on original G1 Transformers, holy crap, what a swan song.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not too sure like what the story is, because I think they stopped doing like G.I. Joe around the same time, and like that kind of moved over to Dick if I recall. And so I'm never sure what side that came from, whether that was Toei pulling away from these sort of collaborations with, you know, US creatives, or whether it was the rug got pulled out from under them. But yeah, we're in for some new studio, so a whole new raft of animation errors for us to point out in season 3, no doubt.
Yeah, it's gonna be quite, just visually, it's probably gonna be even more of a tonal shift than the movie, arguably, because at least everything looked sort of similar. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, we got a new theme song incoming and everything. I like the season 3 theme. Oh yeah, it's a different opening, isn't there? I forgot about that.
Sure is.
We'll be talking about that for about 10 minutes on the next podcast as well, I guess. Folks, thank you very much for listening and or watching this podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, first of all, thank you very much for listening. And if you feel so inclined, why not tell a friend about the show? And also, if you want to, you can leave us a rating on your platform of choice as well. If you'd like to find us on Instagram and Twitter, we are at StarscreamsPod. If you'd like to drop us an email, if we've said something wrong and you want to correct us, you can do so. That being on the email address starscreamsghostpod@gmail.com. And we've sort of alluded to it, so we'll quickly mention it now. All the episodes of the series of Transformers that we watch are done on the Hasbro Pulse YouTube channel. It's a 100% legitimate way to watch the Transformers episodes. That's how we watched season 1 and 2, and that also dictated the ordering of the episodes that we watched as well. And as you just heard us mention, we're going to be sticking with that formula when it comes to season 3 and season 4. You know, all 3 episodes of it. When we get to that point as well. So if you want to come along for the ride on season 3, or if you want to catch up and watch along with us, you can do all of that on the Hasbro Pulse YouTube channel. Andy, before we wrap up for today, any additional closing thoughts?
No, I think I've exhausted everything there is to say about Transformers the movie. I've really not, but trust me, you don't want to get me started again. But no, it's been a good time, and now I can, you know, go for another couple of months until I watch this film again.
Yeah, imagine, you know what you should do? You should watch it after we get through season 3 and 4, and then see what you think.
Yeah, maybe that'll be the ploy. There's always time in my life for watching Transformers the movie again, that's for sure. And I honestly, I will probably be just going and putting the soundtrack on after this podcast, because I'm jonesing to listen to that again.
Yeah, I need to listen to Dare. It's probably the first thing I'm going to do when I've hit the stop button on this record. But no additional thoughts from me, other than it has been a marvellous ride up to this point, and I'm genuinely fascinated to see how season 3 turns out, given everything we've just discussed and different studio, which I forgot was a thing as well. It's going to be a very interesting... If anything, this is probably going to be one of the more interesting parts of the journey now, even though we just did the most interesting part.
Yeah, indeed, and we're moving ever closer to our titular episode, to Starscream's Ghost. So, you know, that's exciting as well.
I mean, yeah, we are getting close to that. And also, folks, I'll say now, this has more than likely been our longest podcast. Chances are next week might be a fairly long one as well, because that's a 5-episode one that we're doing.
Yeah, we're just scrambling all the big ones in together. But after that point, we'll probably be back to like a 3 and 4 episode cadence. I think we'll probably be mostly 3 from that point forward, if I recall. But
there's 30 episodes in season 3, I think it is.
Yeah. So we'll do the maths so that you don't have to. But
there you go.
Yeah, we'll be figuring that out in due course.
Amazing. Folks, thank you very much for checking out this podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. From myself, Jeremy Graves, from him, Mr. Andy Hanley, we have been Starscream's Ghost, quite literally now from this point forward, a Transformers podcast. Until next time, take care and speak to you soon.
Bye, everyone.